call tonight's meeting of the City of Tacoma Park City Council to order. Would the clerk please call the roll?
Mayor Searcy.
Here.
Councilmember Fulcher.
Present.
Councilmember DeBala.
I'm here.
Councilmember Gibson.
Here.
Councilmember Siemens.
Present.
Councilmember Honsack.
Present.
Councilmember Small.
God body, God suffer divine.
All right. Well, thank you all so much. So tonight is one of our special work sessions where we are tackling issues associated with the budget. Tonight we will be discussing the ARPA budget. Just as a quick reminder for folks, we will have our regularly scheduled meeting tomorrow. I'm sorry, Wednesday. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to make everyone nervous. And I apologize, I did not pack my copy of my agenda. So on Wednesday at 7:30, we'll have our regular meeting. And we will be continuing to discuss the budget, including the start of reconciliation. So I want to make sure that we're able to get things done in a reasonable time tonight. So with that, I am going to, I just want to ask my colleagues, Councilmember Gibson, your light is on. Okay, excellent. So I'm going to hand things over to Mr. Eubanks, our acting deputy city manager, who will get us started with tonight's presentation.
Thank you, Mayor. Good evening, Council. We have this evening the city's ARPA manager, Andrew Bolduc, presenting the ARPA budget. Don't have much more to add other than that, but I did want to mention that the city staff have made available to council and the public the full budget, meaning an indexed line item version of the budget that city staff have proposed. It's on the city's website, available for review if folks so choose to take a look. There's also, in addition to the general fund and all other funds, there's also a brief guide to those funds. They are indexed in a very specific way. Each budget code, each line item has a budget code. That budget code denotes either the department or the division or the type of budget item, and so the associated kind of cheat sheet walks anyone who's interested through the detail of how to read that budget. That's it. Other than that, I will turn it over to Andrew.
Okay. Really quick, Councilmember Small, do you have a question?
Yeah, yes, I do, Mayor. Just as a little point of order, I just wanted to say I sent an email earlier today about this sentiment, but it has really been an admirable job done by the senior staff with regard to the presentation of this budget and the specificity by which you can actually find things. All of my questions have been thus far addressed, and it is really clear that there are professionals here who are good at what they do, even if this is going to be a difficult process. And so I wanted to make sure that I said that again. I'll probably say it every Monday, but thank you.
Thank you, and I'll make sure
Second.
to convey the sentiment to staff. Which that also reminds me, regarding questions, we received quite a few questions, I think, between the end of last week and the beginning of this week. So early tomorrow morning, we'll have the first set of answers to council, and then we hope to have a second set either by Wednesday or Thursday of this week.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. All right, so we'll turn it over to Andrew, who will walk through our ARPA budget.
All right, thank you very much, Mayor and Council. Members of the public, my name is Andrew Bolduc, and I'm the ARPA manager. And I have the privilege of presenting the America Rescue Plan Act proposed FY24 budget for this year. And I also have the great fortune of being the only item on the agenda tonight, so I don't know how that happened, but thank you all for being here. An overview of what we're going to talk about tonight. I'm hoping the presentation will be about 20 to 30 minutes. I'll start out by talking about, why we're talking about this during FY24 budget process, what that means. A history of all prior decisions that have been made by this council related to the ARPA spending. A quick overview of compliance and deadlines. I know there's a lot of questions that have come up both by members of the public but also by council and staff about what our compliance obligations are, and hopefully try to clarify some of that. Then I'll get right into FY23 budget highlights and the year-end balances, what's been accomplished in FY23 and where there may be some surplus. And then get right into FY24 budget highlights and amendments and what sort of those decision points council is considering as part of this FY24 budget. And then talk about the 5-year spending plan, which is traditionally the way this council has made ARPA decisions, is through a 5-year spending plan for the remainder of the eligible time to spend ARPA dollars. And then there'll be Q&A time as well. But if anything doesn't make sense, you need me to run over it again, feel free to just pause and let me know. I'm happy to talk about it. So the first portion is just about kind of the why now of this. As this is these are grant dollars that span multiple fiscal years, and the only revenue source is directly from the fund. In a lot of ways, this doesn't need to be part of an FY24 process or an annual budget process, but from a general accounting standpoint, it absolutely needs to be. But with that said, there are decisions that you make tonight that will have concrete, what's the word I'm looking for, impacts on the future of ARPA spending. But there are also decisions that you make tonight that are very fungible, that can be made really at any time between now and, in a budget amendment or otherwise. And then, again, another reason why we're talking about it tonight as part of the FY24 budget is there are proposed dollars from ARPA spending that were part of the original spending plan that would go to support CIP general fund projects. These are broadly part of the category of funds that can be used for the provision of government services and offset other general fund expenditures. A number of municipalities have done this throughout the country, this type of spending to bridge gaps in revenue loss from the past. And I'll talk a little bit about what lost revenue means in a minute. Key highlights from the FY24 budget. I already talked about the $1.1 million reallocation of ARPA funds for CIP projects, as well as $240,000 reallocation of programs that have one that's been very successful, quality of life grants, to continue that program into FY24, as well as some anticipated overage with the city's document management platform, which is really the digitization of citywide records, which is a project that's probably been on a long-term list for a long time. The IT director took me down to the storage room, and I saw the stacks of boxes down there that need to be digitized in some way. So on to the spending plan. What have prior councils, what decisions have they made around spending the city's $17.5 million ARPA award? The first decision that was made, and that was the initial, there was initial guidance provided by the Treasury as to how that funding could be used, and it had very limited bumpers on what revenue loss actually meant. Revenue loss was very specific. There was an accounting that finance departments across the country had to do and say, okay, we've lost this many dollars from recreation programs that weren't, weren't ongoing because of the pandemic, or any other programs where there was a revenue shortfall, and then report that to the Treasury. And then a little bit later in the process, the Treasury amended its interim final rule with a final rule, And they had very different guidance in terms of what lost revenue meant. Lost revenue there could be a standard allocation. Any municipality could either say, okay, we have go through the calculation, and this is our amount of lost revenue. For large municipalities, that was well over $10 million. For municipalities this size, $10 million actually is the better option. So we can just say $10 million standard allowance with the Treasury. We're going to use this, we're going to make this, elect to make this allowance. And then that gives the city broad discretion over how that portion, that $10 million portion, can be used. Very broadly, it can be used for any government purpose, any general fund purpose, with two exceptions. The first is it can't go to a pension plan, and it can't go for debt service. Other than that, it can be used to fill any general fund expenditure. So with the knowledge, and again, this was back in the FY22 budget process, the council at that point decided that they were going to use a portion of revenue loss to support the general fund. And I apologize, there's a typo in that third bullet. It should be 1.19 million in revenue loss, as shown in the table below. And that didn't go to any specific program or project. It just went into the general fund and as a revenue source to offset expenditures. The second decision, closely following that first one, was in the July budget amendment process, which included $2.6 million in project funding. And this was about 7 to 10 projects. This is the initial food security grants proposal, emergency rental assistance, which at the time was called eviction assistance, and also stood up an ARPA posted an ARPA manager to manage the funds, as well as a IT support and finance support, which would also help manage the funds. There were temporary positions, but that wouldn't be their primary function. And then the third decision was the big one. That's the 13.5. That was the balance at the time of the ARPA funds. Council eventually codified that in ordinance number 2022-3, and that outlines the entire 5-year spending plan at the time. There were over 40 projects that were identified by staff, public, council, as I understand, and it was a 6-month process with a consultant called Resource X that went through a whole grading proposal, had a ton of breakout meetings with staff, and eventually brought forward a proposed spending plan to council in, I think, January 22, thereabout. That was later amended through workshops with council over a couple of months, and until that was finalized into the into the ordinance. And the ordinance has more or less nuts and bolts of exactly what's in place today. And that identified 23 new programs and initiatives on top of those already in the first budget amendment for FY22. And then the last decision that was made was in the first budget amendment for FY23, and that was, there was, some spending supposed to have programs that were supposed to commence in FY22. They didn't; those were rolled into FY23, and so it was really just an accounting change at that decision point. And then you'll see it. I'll touch on this in a later slide. In there was a final installment of $6,807. That was just an overage of what we received in the second tranche from the federal government. That was beyond what was anticipated. So that was not allocated as part of the spending plan. And we can have a conversation about what can be done with those funds. So again, I talked about the final rule. Going back into that a little bit is this revenue loss, 10 million standard allowance for any government purpose, but that still means that 7.5 million need to be used for the specific reasons identified in the ARPA award and outlined by the Treasury in the final rule. On the next slide, this is a slide I added from when posted this on Friday. I talk about sort of where I see that funding coming from. We have already outlined the specific Treasury bucket that would fall into that meets these check marks here. And then another question that comes up in terms of timing is the entire award needs to be obligated by December 31, 2024, and the entire award must be spent by December 31st, 2026. If not, it goes back to the federal government. Obligated is a question I've gotten a lot from folks, which is, really, what does that mean? Does it mean budgeted? Does it mean that there needs to be a contract in place? And the Treasury FAQs have some guidance on that point, but really what I understand is municipalities are seeing it as a little bit of a gray area and sort of managing risk based on, some are a little bit more aggressive and say as long as it's in the budget. For example, I think the REC scholarship program is a good example that kind of highlights the distinction. REC scholarship program only occurs when individuals sign up and they meet the income criteria in order to get sort of a grant for the funding. Under a very strict interpretation of the word obligated, that would not pass the test. So that program could not move past 2024, December 31st, 2024, because there is not already sort of a present contract for those funds until the person signs up and makes that request and applies and receives that small grant. There are other things, however, that, like an ARPA manager salary, where maybe there's a letter of hire or some of those other admin expenses, where you could sort of argue, yes, that's been obligated in some way. So I really just sort of point to that to highlight it's not crystal clear. Council in this budget, if approved, there will only be $2.8 million left to be spent after FY24, and so the vast majority of it, we will not have to consider that question at all. Is that clear as mud? Or okay, all right. All right, so this.
Councilmember DeBalinky, put your mic on.
Sorry, is there expected to be any more advice from Treasury on this? Because rec scholarships,
Yeah.
as far as we're concerned, it's obligated. I mean, that's what it's going to get used for, so.
Yeah. I had a conversation with the state organization that's providing assistance to municipalities and spending these funds. And their guidance was, probably not additional, maybe there'll be some additional guidance, but probably not something formal like in the FAQs. It'll really just be a question of council, COUSEL, advising on whether or not it's something fits or does not fit into the definition of obligated.
Councilmember Small.
Thank you, Mayor. I had a follow-up question on this point related to all of the, let's call it beneficent funding that we had previously done. If we, let's say if we were going to continue the grants to, basically the universal basic income thing that we were sort of done. In theory, if you put those funds into a direct sort of deposit fund, like a third-party agency specific thing, wouldn't that basically mean that they had been obligated?
Yes.
And so, and then my further then, I would say what's in that regard, would anything be stopping us per se from extending the free rec to all the kids in town? Because they're all young and could use recreation. In theory, if we dedicated that funding and put it somewhere, couldn't you legally argue, or at least make the argument that it was obligated?
Yeah, I think there's certainly an argument to be made for anything that is in a future budget or planned to be in a future budget is in some way obligated for that purpose. I think there's an argument to be made whether Treasury is going to say, you know, go pound sand or not. I don't know. Yeah. All right, so so there's a ton of information on this slide, but I really just wanted to highlight that, you know, 10 million, the revenue loss allowance that may be used for any government purpose, for any general fund purpose that doesn't fall into any of the other Treasury categories for ARPA funds. But the city needs to keep in mind that 7.5 million must be used for those purposes. So just a quick breakdown of these different projects. The city's kind of close right now. About 8.3 million is what I've identified as consistent with the Treasury code for ARPA purposes. Not that revenue loss, that's a different category, isn't also eligible, just if we're need to highlight 7.5 million for those other purposes, we're close. So when we start talking about moving money around from one place to the other, just something we need to keep track of, make sure we're keeping track of. All right, so when the spending plan was put together, it was talked about as hitting these 6 main points: affordable housing, small business recovery, social service partnerships, family resiliency programs, city operations, and community anchors. And these programs span a wide array, as you all know, from microgrants, emergency assistance, small business grants, to municipal service improvements and infrastructure improvements. So here's the FY23, the total budget when it was passed was 10.1 million, projecting that we'll only spend this year about 4.7 million with a balance of 5.36. Some of the big reasons are the library, that was a $2 million expenditure anticipated to happen in FY23 that's been pushed to FY24. Mental health counselors, crisis counselors, we talked about the last council meeting, has faced some delays. There was a big portion expected to be expended there. Interactive online budget tool has not gotten underway this year, likely FY24. The document management platform as well, not this year, likely FY24. Something that's not on this bullet list too, but there's significant salary savings from the ARPA manager not being hired until this February, as well as the 2 other positions, which was the finance and the IT, which are still budgeted roles. Those were not filled during FY24, so significant salary savings there.
I'm sorry. When you said, specifically when you're talking about the other 2 positions, are those positions that are related to your office per se, or are they funded positions in other parts of the organization? I think it's an important distinction for anybody who's listening, so I'm curious.
Sure. My understanding is that both the IT role and the finance role would have, let's say, 10 to 20% of their role would be focused on ARPA, but the remainder of that would be just supporting those departments.
I'm
Councilmember Fulcher?
What are the interactive online budget tool? Is that the Balancing Act? Is that right?
Balancing Act is actually covered under the community outreach portion.
Okay, so what are the 2 projects that are listed under project delays that are interactive online budget tool and document management platform? Do you mind telling me what those 2 things are?
Absolutely. So the interactive online budget tool, that's something I believe a vendor came forward and did a demo with council maybe last fall to talk about an interactive way to both show the budget, but also for residents, council, whomever, to input suggestions and make other comments about the budget or play with the budget in some way. That's my general understanding of that project.
Is that Balancing Act? Is that right?
Yes, it's there are 2 different portions of Balancing Act. One is kind of this interactive tool that Andrew was alluding to.
Uh-huh.
Another is a smaller, less expensive component that is more of an educational tool. And so the portion I think that's funded from ARPA is the larger of the two aspects of it.
And then, what is the document management platform?
That's what Andrew was alluding to earlier. The city doesn't have a process for digitizing its records, and so the document management tool would essentially allow for that.
Yeah. And for both, I mean, there are a number of vendors that offer these types of services at this point. Interactive Online Budget, I did a demo with, I think it was ClearGov back in September. And it was a much lower price point than what's been budgeted here for that. But there are options. I think it would be a full RFP process in order to identify which vendor and product was one that was right for the city. And then the document management platform, there aren't a ton of vendors in the game, as I understand. Canon is the one that we've talked to and sort of gave us some direction over the budget numbers, but it's a big project. There hasn't been a huge effort towards digitization and organizing those files. And I've gone through a similar process with Laserfiche was the vendor we used for it, and it's a multi-year expensive project that largely needs to be outsourced.
Councilmember DeBala?
Yeah, just to back up to the big picture for a minute. So a couple slides back, you've got the total ARPA award is 17, call it 17.5. Then you've got what we spent in '22. Then this is what happens in what was gonna happen in '23 and what's gonna projected to be unspent. And then, so then the rest of that is 24 and 25 both, or just 24? It's a 5-year plan, so 22,
Yeah,
24.
so the
Where's the 5-year?
Yeah.
Somewhere.
So in the 5-year plan, that's part of the budget book.
Part of the okay, that's where it is, thank you.
Yeah, that identifies. So what I have at the moment, $7.9 million to be spent in FY '24, $1.3 million to be spent in FY '25, and $438,000 to be spent in FY '26.
Yeah, great,
With
okay.
about $1 million of surplus.
Thank you for pointing to the 5-year plan in the actual budget. Okay, just wanted to get it in context, thank you.
Sure.
Mayor.
And
Councilmember Small?
thank you, Mayor. The other thing, I just wanted to reiterate something that you said that is essentially quiet part loud here, and so I wanted to amplify it. And that is that not only was there probably a lot of other budgetary options for budgeting tools that explain the context of long-term spending and moving things around, because there are several that do that, but also the fact that that decision was made at a level where, even though it happened, it didn't necessarily reflect the fact that there were other opinions or other things that were going on. I just wanted to make sure that we amplified that as we move forward and try to at least move past some of the more, let's call it, explicit decision-making concerns of any sort of previous administrations.
All right.
Okay.
So another slide will show this. There's a number of unimplemented programs disbursements that haven't occurred, or project plans that have not been developed due to staffing capacity and staff transitions. But on the positive side, the city distributed over $2.8 million in grants, which is more than half of the total amount spent in FY '23. And these go to the purposes. I won't read them all outlined there. And then Finance has hired temporary assistance that is being coded to that admin line, as well as hired an ARPA manager.
I'm sorry, Mayor.
What's that?
Councilmember Small?
I apologize, Mayor. I did have one other question about the digitization, and I wanted to just highlight the fact that in the process of doing that, one of the things that's a real concern is whether or not those digital documents are stored within the United States or not. Having gone through a process like that, it is an important distinction. And I just wanted to make sure that that was on the table as you guys were discussing it.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's a good point. I know we've had some internal conversations around procurement and, the nuclear-free assurance and environmental concerns, and that's certainly one to consider. All right, so next slide. So this is one of my favorite slides. This is just talking about sort of savings and overall unencumbered surplus that exists at the end of FY23. I talked about the salary savings. It's $261,000 in surplus for FY23. Premium pay for essential workers was something that was awarded in FY22, but the actuals for that are about 30,000 less. I believe the metric that was used for in order for people to be eligible for that premium pay just didn't add up to the what was expected at the time or projected at the time. The financial software upgrade. This is a project that's different than Interactive Online Tool. This was again advanced all the way back in FY22 as a need for the city to have an upgrade in its financial software. And Tyler Technologies, the city's current vendor, actually on their own created is making an update that the city's moving along with them right now. The finance team also looked at vendors that they were initially considering for a financial software update, and the costs were astronomically and very cost prohibitive. So the combination with that and the administrative adjustment to a new financial software tool, the finance team recommended that we not pursue this particular program.
And I'm sorry, I do have one question. I'm
Councilmember
sorry.
Gibson?
My bad, Randy. I didn't
Just-
see.
Just a quick question. What is premium pay? I just don't, not sure what that is.
So that's for essential workers who went sort of above and beyond
Okay,
in response to the
okay, now I know.
COVID-19 pandemic.
Thank you.
I don't actually know, David. I don't know if you know what the specific criteria were for that program, but I'm happy to find.
I don't
that out
recall
for you.
offhand, but it's essentially the folks that were still required to show up in person during the pandemic will receive the premium pay.
Yep. What happened was during the dollars came later in the process of response. The city of Tacoma Park was able to offer hazard pay for folks who were still working and had interactions with the public during the pandemic, but we had to cut that off earlier than we would have preferred because the pandemic lasted longer than many of us anticipated. And so when we received the ARPA dollars, one of the options that we had for use of those dollars was to give folks, in essence, that hazard pay that they rightfully should have had because they had been working in hazardous conditions over the course of the pandemic and they weren't necessarily reimbursed for that. So that was one of the first things that we did once we were aware that we were going to receive the ARPA dollars and this was an allowable expense. Mm-hmm. Councilmember Small?
Thank you, Mayor. And I'm sorry, this may be technically back a slide, but when you're talking about it seems like the I don't know, let's call it the ticket thing for Public Works isn't in here, hasn't been expressly discussed, and I thought that was paid for by ARPA monies. So I just wanted to ask about where it is and where the process is on completion, if it's not on this presentation.
Sure. It was not a ARPA-funded project. And we are in the process now of finalizing the agreement with the vendor. And I think we hope to have that imminently, certainly before the end of the fiscal year.
To me, that's a good resource.
All right, so a couple other lines on this unencumbered surplus slide. Final installment difference, I talked about that before. but also account interest from FY22. So that's the interest-bearing account that the ARPA funds have been sitting in. The Treasury guidance is actually very clear that any income for this can either go into the general fund or be spent through any of the other allocations for ARPA. So that's I just account that here. The interest-bearing account, that interest has gone up in FY23. So I don't have a projection for what that number will be. I don't know if it will be much more significant than that small amount, but just wanted for full accounting, talk about that here. So this is maybe my less favorite slide, but this is underdeveloped projects and disbursements. These are projects that, well, I will say the CP2 grants and the mini grants Spark, there was a little bit of overlap in the food insecurity grant program. $250,000 has been allocated for that, with about $90,000 each year, as well as the quality of life grants. That's $110,000. And later on, I already talked about it, I guess, at the onset, is that some of those funds be reallocated to continue that program into FY24, and already had a round of grant applications for that. The Community Connectors project, there is not currently a project plan with that. There were no disbursements in FY23. Workforce development, similarly. Community engagement, that little bit that was spent, that's the initial startup costs and subscription fees of the budget software. That is where that's being expended, the interactive budget software David talked about earlier. And if you look in the 5-year plan, those ongoing subscription fees, I believe, are about $5,000 a year.
So I do have a question about that slide. One of the things that I did notice in our budget is the sheer volume of various smaller scale grant programs, and I just thinking through staff capacity and the number of grant programs. Does it make sense for us to manage so many smaller grants individually versus reconcile or compiling monies to offer larger grant awards and manage, in essence, fewer grants as in terms of city staff? So that was one of the things that came across to me, because I just understand that there's a lot that goes into managing grant programs. And so to what extent are some of the proposals that you're making, you talked about reallocating, designed to try to address some of those capacity issues? Because I'm seeing so many of these smaller kind of projects that could, in essence, be somewhat labor intensive for staff are not getting completed. And so I just wanted to get a better feel for why that may be the case.
And I'd like to echo what the mayor said also, but like, is there like some sort of common application or funneling process so that, you know, there's a person that is making reasonable decisions, like based on the number of programs, so that, you know, it would just seem like if we're gonna have so many, that there would at least be some sort of common vehicle in the same way that we have sort of common vehicles for employment here.
And to add another layer to this, we have a grants committee. And so some of this goes to the grants committee right now and some of it doesn't, but is that another way to help streamline for staff to
Yeah.
use that volunteer resource?
Yeah, so overall in this proposed budget, the grants to nonprofits, the CP2 grants, the mini grants Spark, and the workforce development, as well as a portion of the community engagement funds, are proposed to be reallocated. One to the quality of life grants, that $110,000, but then to the other two purposes, for CIP, spent the $1.1 million for CIP spending, and the $130,000 in the document management platform kind of cost overage. So I hear what you're saying. It is a lot, and that's definitely something I heard from staff, that this is a lot of smaller grants. But outside of these, the other grant programs that the city has, those are ongoing and those are successful right now. So I wasn't getting sort of that request to either to pool or otherwise. I think where the value is, and the quality of life grants is a great example, is expanding the program beyond the initial term. So if it's just a one-year grant program, making a quality of life grant that's been successful and we have applicants and can't spend the money fast enough, expanding that into future years, reallocating funds for those purposes.
Great, thank you. Councilmember DeBala.
No, sorry.
No, Councilmember Gibson.
Yeah, I guess this is the time that I didn't know whether we were going to wait until we got into FY24 to talk about the Community Connectors
Talk
program.
about
or
whenever
other
you want. Yeah.
But it sounds, look, we're getting into it a little bit. I do recall reading that the rationale for not using those funds, Community Connectors in particular, was the lack of having a project managers or staff with project management skills. Is that correct? And I guess to get into that program, which hasn't begun, I'm just wondering, would we be starting from scratch, or are there models around the country that we could, learn from to help us, again, kind of overcome some of the learning curve that we would otherwise have?
Yeah. So I would say the only reason why it's not included in FY24 budget, and similar with the direct cash assistance program, is that at least for the Community Connectors program, there is not a project plan at the moment. There very well could develop one. That could, council, you could tell me, Andrew, let's find a model like that and let's propose a project plan that works. The reason I left it out is I just wanted council to have sort of a clear picture of what is unallocated at this point. And same thing with direct cash assistance. Didn't know how successful the program would continue to be, although we're getting March, there were 2.6 applications approved today. So that program is chugging along. But there are many other options that I've shared with some council members and the public in terms of what we could do with the balance of those funds. And I think that's a key question for council as part of this process is you could say, again, at any time, you could amend it and say, okay, there's a project plan for this. We want funds to be shown as dispersed or budgeted for FY24. You could say the entire balance of direct cash assistance, I want to show that as expended in FY24. You can say the same thing with the Community Connectors, and then come back to you and have a discussion on what to do with those funds.
So if I might just clarify the distinction between, at least I thought I read that there wasn't staff capacity versus, now you're saying that there isn't a project plan. Do we have staff capacity to do it if we could get a project plan?
I think we'd have to be creative in how to manage staff capacity for a program like that.
Mm-hmm.
It is something, as far as I know, City of Tacoma Park has never done before as a kind of a core municipal service.
Right.
But there are models from other communities that have tried similar things, and it is specifically identified in the Treasury
Right.
guidance that this is an eligible use for funds.
And one last follow-up then, can the ARPA money be used to hire a project manager?
Absolutely.
I mean, yes.
Yeah, absolutely.
So if that would be one way to work around. I mean, it would obviously be a temporary job, so it wouldn't be a long-term FTE. Thank you.
So I do want to pick
Yeah.
up on that point, in keeping in my mind the timeline for obligating and finalizing the programs. I know, it feels like, 2026, we got plenty of time. I'm like, not really, right? Because we're talking about the 2024 budget. By the time for those programs that don't already have the infrastructure in place where we could just pump money into, it takes some startup time. If we're going to hire, it requires time to hire someone, to bring them on board, to get this stuff rolling. So, but I will say of of all of the items, the community connectors is one that is, in my view, one of the most important ones, because hindsight is 2020, but if we had the community connectors in place, our activities around direct cash assistance could have potentially been lessened. I mean, we had people in multifamily buildings who just took it upon themselves to go door to door, to remind their neighbors, to be that trusted source of information for people, to walk people through it. But I do think that, particularly in some of our, for some of our harder to reach populations, having a community connectors program, if we could figure it out, would be really, really helpful in terms of administering a number of programs that we have today and what we may have in the future. Things like trying to get people to volunteer for committees. So I do think that if we had to pick our poison in terms of the short list, trying to come up with a way to identify the community connectors. Now, if it is the case that this is just too much money, which is possible, and we want to start off with a smaller scale pilot, treating it something to the effect of how we would do a committee, so to speak, or we offer stipends and kind of using that as a model of what it is that exactly they're being asked to do, I would be open to that. But I do think that we would need to come up with a project plan for how we would address this. And I think it relates a lot to the community engagement components as well. Councilmember Honzak.
Thanks, Mayor Searcy, and I wouldn't normally repeat something that the mayor said, but more than anything, as I spend a lot of time on the ARPA budget more than the rest of the binder, and I think part of that is because I come from the poorest ward where I just see extreme vulnerability and populations who haven't typically linked well with our city government. I want to really emphasize what the mayor has just said and maybe say a few more words, which is when I started running for the campaign back in September, I noticed immediately I took 2 pieces of paper with me everywhere to every door I knocked on, and I knocked on hundreds of doors, the direct cash assistance and the Chromebooks from the city, from the county. And I learned a lot in doing that. And I would say the number one thing I learned is that the city simply wasn't reaching almost any of our residents. And since then, I salute some members of the staff who have tried to work with me, like Debbie Huffman, who helped me try to figure out how we could get some in-person events in Ward 5, our poorest ward. This should have been the place where we had in-person events. I don't know that we had a single in-person event to distribute direct cash assistance, and I say that only because we need to still do that. So and we need community connectors of some sort. I'm very happy to sit down and try to brainstorm with your staff, with others on the city staff about that, because I've literally spent hours and hours of my personal time because I'm just passionate about it. And the more that I walked door to door, the more passionate I became about how necessary it was that somebody just put in the manpower, especially when I saw that our comm staff is only 2 people. Mm-hmm. So somehow we've got to fund community connectors. And I'm not as concerned about the dollar amount as I am about the principle of cracking that nut and then backtracking to figure out how we're going to make it work. So I don't have the full answer, but I can tell you a number of the things that I've been trying, and some of them that have been more successful and less successful. And I think I've begun to see where the windows of opportunity could be and which NGOs are actually active in those spaces. And I am sure that my colleague in Ward 6 and my other colleague in Ward 4 in particular, where they have a lot of the lower income residents, the vulnerable residents, and they exist in every ward, to be clear, but could really go farther than it has to date. Thanks.
Thank you.
Councilmember Small.
Thank you, Mayor. And I apologize for the nuanced or different opinion on this subject, particularly of community connectors. And so I want to make my position on it pretty clear. I find the current conception of this program to be exceedingly paternalistic. I think that the manner in which we have been discussing it presupposes that poor people are, I don't know, stupid people or not busy people. And in particular, there are people who are supposed to be on staff whose job it is to provide services to the residents of this city. I am quite concerned about what appear to be independent third-party groups salivating over the opportunity to spend this money on themselves. And in particular, I haven't seen those groups being concerned about undocumented populations or walking around in my ward or talking to people in vertical buildings. And so I am very resistant to anyone spending this money in that manner, when in actuality, we could expand the application process and maybe spend some more money on blanketing the neighborhoods with flyers, because that's what people who are impoverished are used to doing, and then spend the money on the people, because I am fully against spending this money for the benefits, inadvertently or directly, of any of the alphabet organizations that think that they are operating here with some sort of concern for people, because I just haven't seen them.
And I just want to clarify, the genesis of the community connectors was not about funding organizations, but funding individuals that are serving that role already, and making sure that they are adequately compensated and empowered and have the resources.
And I appreciate you making that distinction. And I'd like to make that distinction over and over and over again, because if we're trying to provide services to people who need them, we don't need to give money to people who are sitting around bored.
Yeah. So that is the distinction of the program, that at least the thought behind it was that we have a number of people and I can name a number of them in our multifamily buildings.
And you'd be right.
We have a lot of people who are already doing some of that challenging work. And it's not just the fact that they're doing the work, it is that they are viewed by their neighbors as a valid source of information and can be trusted. I cannot tell you how many times I went in Hampshire Towers passing out flyers to let people know about direct cash assistance, only to have some of our immigrants.
Told them.
Yeah, immigrant consistence. They're like, no, she told me, but or is it true? Is it real? But if Doris says it is real, right? So making sure that those residents in our community have the resources and access to, they're not just printing out things on their inkjets in their apartments to try to get information out, that we're providing them with the necessary infrastructure to help us with getting the word out.
Thank you, Mayor. I really appreciate you making that distinction. Thank you.
Yep. Councilmember DeBala.
Thank you. You probably want to get back to the rest of your 23 presentation.
Thought we were gonna be early tonight, wrong.
But while we're on this subject, two things. One, I completely, having been around when we originally conceived the community connectors, what the mayor described is what we had in mind. Originally, the idea was that the three pieces would go together, the direct cash assistance, the grants to some nonprofits, particularly around food, and the community connectors to identify people in the neighborhoods who live there, who work, who talk, who live there, who know their neighbors, who, well, what she just said. So that was the original idea, and I still think it's very important that we pursue it. And so I would like to see, personally, I would like to see that one move up on the list. My second question, not to be answered right this minute, but I'm still a little confused about which of the grant programs we had before we had COVID money and which ones were new. So workforce development was new, the food grants was new. I'm a little confused about CP2 grants and mini grants, and the STEM program. Not to do all that right now, but I would like someone to help me out with that, because I'm still a little fuzzy on how much of this is substituted, is amplifying money, programs we had before the pandemic, and how much of this is new and targeted for, based on the ARPA rules.
The majority of
Somebody
the,
started-
the majority of the programs, grant programs that were included in FY '23 and before and after are existing programs. So CP2 and food insecurity has actually historically been the same. The mini grants was an existing general fund funded grant, as was community quality of life. And Spark, Spark mini grants. All of those were existing grant programs that were moved over to ARPA when ARPA dollars became available.
And so presumably at some point, in a couple, 3 years, they will be back in the general fund, but perhaps not at this level of intensity.
Right, and that was the thing that changed. So
Okay.
the funding amount for many of these
Thank you.
increased. Not for all of them, but for many of them.
Okay, thank you for explaining that. Yeah, so can we finish with 23 before we start talking about 24? Thank you.
Yes. All right, Councilmember Gibson.
Just a question or a concern that, again, this is ARPA funding that we're talking about for various programs, and including the connectors, that ends. So the sustainability, I think, is a central question. And these individuals that are being considered, or that would be considered for the community connectors, there might be value, as Councilmember DeBala says, that they're connected to organizations for that sustainability issue. We don't want to start something and then leave them high and dry.
Councilmember Hanzak.
I'm sorry to belabor this point, except I'm not, because this is just too important. I believe strongly that sustainability is fundamental here as we look through each line item. I mean, for example, if we give out a grant to a group that's been here for a long time and they grow their budget this year and then they have to shrink back in 3 years, that gives me a lot of concern. I'm also concerned if we get some community connectors, some cash that they've begun to depend on. It's hard to imagine we'd give them that much, but these are more vulnerable populations. That could be of concern, and we might not even be able to have success later with other things. However, right now, this was pandemic funding, and what we haven't done very successfully is to reach those vulnerable populations with the critical information in a timely way that needed to be gotten out to those populations when they needed it. And I did learn some history today, actually, about the fact that the previous council had considered trying to wait to do the Community Connectors program at the same time as the direct cash assistance, and it was decided to go early with the direct cash assistance. But it's not too late for us to use community connectors in order to get out further on direct cash assistance. And so, I just would welcome us exploring that particular pathway, and we could link it with some other critical city services that haven't been reaching those populations in order to lay the foundation for the future, such as connecting all the northern part of my ward, largely Spanish-speaking and immigrant populations, to know that there are scholarships available at the city for the next 3 years, more than normal, and that there are recreational services that they can connect to that they didn't know about, to kind of get the pathways moving on regular communications connectivity within those neighborhoods with the city, so that we as a city know the pathways that we then need to follow. Maybe they won't require financial resources in the future, but knowing the touch points. So that's what I'd like to see happen, and I hope we can do that.
All right, Andrew.
All
You
right.
can keep trying to make it through 2022, 23.
No, I told you it was my least favorite slide. And I will just, I guess, follow up on the kind of your decision-making in terms of the budget. I outline in a later slide which buckets have been reallocated from. I intentionally left any surplus in community connectors and the direct cash assistance program completely alone. So that is not something that, as part of this budget process, you would be amending in any way. That said, as part of your later process with the budget, it's your prerogative to show those as being fully spent in FY24 or in out years if you so choose. So just so you're aware that that's the decision points in front of you. All right, next slide. These are two programs where I just sort of categorize them as presently underdeveloped. The municipal broadband program initially was meant to go to help low-income households pay for internet connectivity. Ran into some hurdles working with providers in making that happen. And what's currently in the projected actual spending is a digital equity analysis for the city of Tacoma Park. That's at the tail end of being presented to the city. That may have some recommendations as to where gaps can be closed and other sort of spending options. But at this point, the remainder of that balance is not currently earmarked towards any specific plan.
Real quick, Andrew,
Yes, sir.
to that point too, what happened, if I remember correctly, during the peak of the pandemic, what also started to happen was there are a lot of internet carriers that start to offer extremely reduced internet access, which also caused us to kind of pose the question of need. So you had MCPS that was giving out lots of Chromebooks and hotspots. You then had different internet providers that were offering very low, reduced internet access. So then the question, and we of course wanted to work into internet access as part of our municipal infrastructure modifications, which is something we're doing as part of like the library and the like. So I do think that the proposed approach of really trying to assess the digital divide and the need is the right place for us to start, because to your point, trying to establish that infrastructure is quite costly. And then there were a number of workarounds that were that just naturally came up as a result of the pandemic. Now, I don't know the sustainability of a lot of those efforts that went forward during the pandemic in terms of reduced internet. But I do just want to say that I think that this makes sense for me in terms of what an appropriate next step might be.
Great.
Councilmember DeBala.
So the balance unspent, but there's this digital divide study that will inform how we might want to use that money.
Correct.
This is not unspent, and we're not going to continue this work. Just clarifying.
Right, yeah. Work will continue as currently presented. 185,000 is in the FY24 budget, and the balance of that 185,000 is
25.
planned to be reallocated for other purposes at this time. So that total 400,000 will drop by 185,000.
Okay, we'll let you finish your explanations then,
Sure.
huh?
Yeah. And just real quick, so the study, the FY23, the study, do we know when we would get that?
We're at the tail end. I don't know if you want Jessica, anything you want to add? We are at tail end.
Okay.
Yeah, tail end. I believe we received a draft of the final report, and we're providing comments and asking for some additional information.
Excellent. Thank you.
Yeah. And very similarly with the Tacoma Langley Crossroads Business Incubator, my understanding that was originally proposed to be sort of a brick and mortar location to help startup or expansion of businesses. And there hasn't been an identified site or other sort of spending for the full 500,000. It's a little low to try and get site control and build something. And it's a little high for some of the things in between. So that similarly has a retail assessment, I believe it's called, that we just received a final report on over the weekend that will similarly have some potential suggestions and recommendations for other ways that we could use this funding.
Can I ask one more question?
Councilmember DeBala.
And for both of those studies, assuming that staff needs some time to read it and absorb it and all of that, but at some point, would both of those be available to council members who happen to be interested in the topic?
I
Who am I supposed to
presume
be
so.
looking at?
I don't know
Yeah.
what the practice
Yeah,
has been
knowing
in
that
the
that's not
past,
right
but-
now.
Yeah, I
Okay.
presume so, once it's final.
Right, once
Yeah.
it's final.
Yeah.
Great, thank you.
Yeah. Here's just a list of projects that are developed or underway, and they're just being pushed out. These will all be pushed out into FY '24. One I do want to highlight here is the energy efficiency upgrades. Projected actual $150,000 of dollars awarded in FY '23, but actually the entire $500,000 has been granted at this point, and there are grant agreements in place. The reason why there's a little bit of lag on the expenditure side is because there are grant assurances with certain measurables for energy efficiency that after they're built need to be proven that are being met before we hand out the funds. So that's the reason. So if there's anything in sort of unspent dollars that I could say, okay, this is actually obligated, we can't touch this, it's those funds, because we already do have agreements for those.
If I,
Councilmember Gibson.
yeah, I just wanted to follow up on that. That sounds great. Are there, is there a assessment or a report in terms of how much energy is being saved? I mean, getting the money out is one thing, but I'm in terms of our goals, our climate-related, environment-related, is there a report on how much energy has been saved?
I'm not aware of a report right now, but Daryl, I don't know if you have.
I don't know whether we'll be able to compile it. One of the requirements is that they have to apply to Energy Star portfolio, so they have to include all their energy use data in the EPA's application. And so I'm not sure how we'll be able to access that, but it allows them to track their energy use over time, and there's a reporting component. So we'll know a starting point, and then they'll be able to track it over time, because with most of these energy costs, you don't see it immediately. It's, a year or more after implementation.
Right, well, that would be great to have when we do have the data.
Okay. So this is one of my favorite slides. These are the ongoing and completed projects where funds are, as I mentioned before, some of these grants like the food insecurity.
So sorry,
Oh, sure,
Andrew. We
sorry.
might need you to back
I'm
up.
sorry, would you mind backing?
Oh,
up?
no, that's fine.
Okay. And if this is too big of a loaded question, or this is not a good time to talk about it, I wouldn't have normally asked it in the middle, but since we're going through this line by line. Library expansion. Can you just speak a little bit, if in so much as this is in your purview, to how much the bows are tied, the dots, the I's are dotted on the library expansion project? It is my understanding that every dollar that we've allocated towards the expansion of the library has already been contracted out, including the ARPA dollars. Can you clearly speak to that so that I understand and can articulate that?
The short answer is the library project is, the sources for that project come from various places. One of the sources is ARPA, and every dollar that has been allocated to the project has an equivalent expense. So there's no wiggle room in, there's no ability to adjust the sources without essentially defunding the project. And given where we are, have started interior demolition, just about through the permitting process and ready for exterior demolition, any adjustment would be detrimental.
So, again, I'm sorry, I don't want to derail us, but it's such a big dollar amount that I'm looking at it in both directions, sort of, and I think that we've seen what appears to be some delays still, and I'm looking at you because this is really more a question that I know you were standing up there and I was asking you before. Can you very quickly give us a update on how delayed that might be, such that we might actually see this number, the potential need for the numbers to rise, even because of delays?
Yeah, thank you for the question. About 6 months behind. That's exclusively due to delays in the permit process, particularly associated with the county's Department of Permitting Services. The good news is we have, I guess this is inevitable at some point, you have to get closer, right? But we're about as close as we have been to finalizing the permitting process. And the next and final steps, what we believe to be final steps, are very clear. And so I will not put a time to when we expect to hear back, and when full scope of the remaining items will be delivered, received, and approved. But we are very close, I think, to beginning our exterior demolition. In terms of additional costs, likely. We have had our team together for that entire 6 months, and they did not anticipate 6 months of delays when they priced the project. And so that has cost implications. We haven't received anything formal from any of the partners that are associated with the project, but we anticipate, given the delays, given the changes in material and labor costs, that the 6-month delay will have a cost implication. I cannot at this moment, with any clear certainty, give you a magnitude of cost differential.
And given that potential, and every dollar is already allocated, how much wiggle room did we have previously in the budget?
So there's soft cost and hard cost contingency. It's been so long since I've talked about it that I don't remember
That's
the numbers off the top of my head.
Okay.
But the percentage of the contingency was 5% of hard costs being construction costs, and there was a much smaller soft cost contingency. Most of our soft costs we were majority through, and so there's a positive delta with the soft costs. So we can assume that those soft costs can be attributed to any changes that we might see. The challenge with the hard costs is that we haven't started, and so a good portion of those hard costs, hard cost contingencies, you typically during a project of this type, you would incur during the demolition and the site work. And so because we haven't begun that, it's hard to, again, put a number to the amount of money that might be available for not the things that are associated with the site know are unknown, but do those cost increases. But we can give you the dollar amounts. I think what you're asking, though, council member, is there a need to set aside some additional funds for the library? And I think it would be, it would potentially be a wise move.
I do want to be clear about where I lean, and publicly so. There have been a lot of concerns about how expensive this project has become, and there's a lot of unfortunate circumstances that have, led to where we are today. I would love to have a really hard and difficult conversation about whether there's any wiggle room on anything else that we could do to address this besides simply increasing the impact on the budget. I am super concerned about how very expensive it has become for the city, and given how much many residents would like to see our budget be managed better. This is a place that is just worth having some kind of conversation about. It's big. These are big dollars, and at some point we have to ask, should it be coming out of ARPA dollars? In spite of the fact that I am very, very aware that the library is used by a lot of families as a form of a place to get books, and reading materials, and resources, and a safe place for children to be. I've seen it with my own eyes. There might be other ways to do that too. I'm super concerned about how many millions of dollars this is costing the city.
There's
And the delays, and I'm not blaming and pointing a finger at anybody. It's just it's an unfortunate set of circumstances.
I do want to be clear. Unless we expect to have a shared building for the foreseeable future, there's no walking back. So we do need to finish the project, and the budget was set, but for these delays in the permitting, which were very much unforeseen. And uncontrollable. I mean, it is outside of the ability for the city or the city's partners to account for. And it is, I think if there's anybody to hold accountable, I think it is potentially our counterparts at the county.
Yep.
It's the delay in that process that has impacted the cost, and it's clear as day that that's the case.
Yep. And I just want to say very firmly that the county and the county council, the county exec are fully aware that they have substantial problems in their Department of Permitting Services. That is not only costing delays for us, but a number of our businesses in our community who are trying to get work done and cannot get work done because of the permitting process.
And it's been par for the course for a while.
So this is, when people ask about what should you advocate for? Improvements in Department of Permitting Services at the county. Because time is money and money is time. And we are spending a lot of time focused on the permitting piece. I mean, I'm very grateful to our county council member, Stewart. We've sent emails. She's really shaken our stuff loose. But to that point, we are still dealing with the back and forth. And we also have businesses. I've talked to businesses in our community who are trying to do construction projects and are being held up by permitting.
And I'd argue, I hate to jump in here, Mayor, I apologize, but on this point, this is a problem of the Maryland National Capital Parks and Planning Commission, a quasi-state organization that is also having these issues in Prince George's County. And so it's not like there aren't quasi-state or county actors who are accountable to these municipalities and businesses who are playing games. And it's not fair to hold the staff or the people who are attempting to do these things accountable for these things. I could tell so many stories about a previous life and the inability to even move things unless you get the right person who used to work there. And so those things are institutional problems of favor that need to end.
All right, Councilmember DeBala.
Yeah, we're going to get through 23. We really are. But I wanted to ask if there is a time schedule to discuss the library, not tonight. I have two questions.
Do
That's
not
my
have
first
my
one.
plan, my outlook, my agenda outlook, which is unfortunate.
Is it on the list?
I believe it is, but I would have to go back and look.
All right,
We're-
all
we're-
right.
it's just-
We're
Request
scheduled to
that-
have quarterly meetings.
Yes.
And I think we just had a meeting not long ago. Unfortunately, there's not much of an update,
not much to
other than
report.
just
Okay.
the continued
Okay.
conversation about permits.
But nothing
What
else.
else
So my
is already
second
on?
question, what was that?
Correct. I think the only other thing, and Acting Deputy City Manager Eubanks, I don't know to what extent our potential legislative resources is reflected in the budget, but I could imagine that that may be the only other thing.
I'd be more explicit about that. So the shovel-ready money, the $2 million bond, shovel-ready bond that you don't have to pay back, have we heard about that officially?
Yeah, that
So-
was my second question.
Yep, so we may have received funding, I believe,
Yeah,
$125,000.
it's 150 or less. I don't remember the
Yeah,
exact
yeah.
number.
It's not the amount that was requested. So although I'm very grateful for our District 20 delegation for getting what they did,
For sure.
but if the question is, what conversation are we likely to have as it relates to the budget? I think for the library, I think one of the main, I mean, of course, council members can bring up whatever they like, but the major budgetary impact for 2024 would likely be us trying to incorporate those additional resources should we receive, and when we may receive them and how that plays into the budget. I hope that answers the question.
Yes, Mayor, thank you.
And just, I want to, I think I would do myself a disservice if I left this completely unopen. I think the 6-month delay, while there will be cost implications, we're not talking $3 million worth of cost implications. It's significant, but it's, if I had to guess, I'd say that it's under $1 million worth of cost, and that is an extremely high estimate. So just to put parameters around the numbers that we're talking about, it's not beyond, I think, what we can try to accommodate for through reasonable means. And again, that $1 million estimate is well outside the range of what I would reasonably think is true.
Yeah. And I think it's important, for us as well to keep in mind, we worked in the contingencies. We've started construction. We've pursued some additional resources, which is paying out a little bit. And so unfortunately, we're in a position where we kind of have to wait and see, right? Because again, the clock matters. So if we get the approvals next week and we're able to make up some time in other places along the project, that might help us out. But until we get those final permits and we're able to proceed, we won't really know.
And if we had zoning authority, then that would be a whole different issue. But we don't, because we are a municipality of a certain size and would have to go through a big to-do to do it. The only thing we could possibly do is the Urban Renewal Authority, and that law is attenuated, although I did figure it out and we could use it if we wanted to.
Councilmember Siemens?
Thank you. I was just curious if this is still your least favorite slide.
That's a great question. Yeah, right.
All right. We're done now. We're done.
All right. And I will make just a side comment on library expansion or any capital project where there are significant overages. I've seen a lot of municipalities use ARPA funds to cover that gap. Specific towards lost revenue is what the Treasury talks about, but another impact that ARPA has had on all of us is huge inflationary impacts that we've seen. So for a one-time spending for a capital project like this and overages that have occurred as a result of the pandemic, I think that's fairly in line with ARPA purposes. All right, so this was my more favorite slide. These are just projects that have been ongoing or completed. These are successful projects, multifamily housing rehabilitation. All grants were awarded, in line for another round next year. The recreation scholarships and tutoring program we don't have sort of actual numbers on that yet, but it's looking like that'll be $150,000 spread over 2 years. And that is a program I do like to sort of stop and think about the long-term financial sustainability of ARPA dollars and programs that have come into being during the ARPA process. There's no funding for that after FY24. That sees a complete cliff, and that program will no longer be provided. So
I'm sorry, which one?
recreation scholarships and tutoring. Same thing with multifamily housing rehabilitation. So just something to think about for a future discussion is if there are areas where reallocations can occur, are there ways to have more fiscal stairs rather than a fiscal cliff to fold some of these programs or projects into a general fund over time?
I'm sorry, Mayor.
Councilmember Small?
I would add to that too, that there are some of these things specifically with regard to recreation and youth and racial equity even, that are component parts of the council priorities. And I'm also sort of reticent to attach disappearing dollars conceptually to those kinds of programs.
All right, so we're through FY23.
Yeah, you're doing a great job, man. Like this is highly professional stuff. You are a good employee, man.
Thank you. All right, so talked I think about a lot of this already, but in the FY24 budget, anticipated $7.9 million will be expended. A huge portion of that is reallocating funding from FY23 unspent dollars into FY24. It's going to be an exciting year. A library potentially breaking ground, and communities. A number of great programs that will come underway. The other two decision points are just about the reallocations, and I've been sort of talking about that throughout. And the next slide, I'll sort of specifically lay out where I'm seeing those funds coming from to support those reallocations. And then to the point of there has been some discussion, I understand, in Congress of drawing back any unobligated ARPA funds. And there's been a little bit of a push to, just in case, I can't foresee it happening, but just in case that occurs, what position is Tacoma Park in? The good news is the vast majority of all ARPA fund spending is slated to occur in FY24. So that reality may not bite Tacoma Park the way it may other municipalities that don't have such a robust spending plan. Here's just a couple of amendments to sort of talk about what had been in the FY24 spending plan. Again, a lot of things are moving to from FY23 to FY24. A little bit of adjustment in the admin salaries and benefits. The library expansion, there is $3.5 million in the FY24 budget, and the mental health crisis counselors. There's a larger number there because that should be implemented. It was thought it was going to be implemented in FY23, implemented in FY24. That's the number. Sure. Yep.
Councilmember DeBala?
One question of fact. So interactive budget tool, so
Oh, yeah.
that's the same amount of money.
Correct. Yep.
The document management platform, is that the one that is gonna cost more? One of these is gonna cost more, and I can't remember now which one is which.
Yeah, I apologize. So that must be a typo there. Yes, the number in the FY24 budget for that is $230,000
For the document management platform.
for document management platform. Yes.
And that's 230,000, part of which is the money that didn't get used because we haven't started the project.
Correct. Yeah.
And remind me if someone sent us some detail, let me rephrase that. One of my budget questions is gonna be just a little more detail on how we went from 100 to 230,000 on the project.
Yeah.
And I'll write that down.
Yep.
Don't have to do that now.
Yeah. No, it's okay. No, I asked Z, the IT director, the
Yeah,
same.
Z's gonna know.
Yeah, the same question, and his initial response was he took over the project after the original allocation had occurred, and in his conversations with our sort of vendor consultant, which is Canon, was that number was going to be much higher. So that's the through an RFP process, maybe that number isn't
Right.
as big of a pill to swallow, but
But as you pointed out before, it's a huge project.
it's a big project. It's
Yeah.
not going to all happen in FY '24. It's going to span several fiscal years.
That's what I was wondering
Yeah.
about also, was how much of that is gonna hang into 25, but.
Yeah, I would suspect
Let's keep
a
going.
portion. Yeah.
So I have a real quick question about the small business grants. So it looks like
Yeah, that's the next question.
there's no planned funding for 2025, 2026. So we're just spending out the leftovers of the, what was about 150? I'm just trying to make sure, because the numbers look a little wonky, 156.
Yeah, right.
And the budget is like 22, we funded, what, 149 for, and basically we kind of did a little bit of a dance to split the money up,
Right.
the 300K. So I just want to make sure that, with a $38,000, which I think is fine,
Yeah.
but it's not a lot of money. So,
Out, yeah.
do we know whether or not we're gonna have to go out again? Is there a plan to go out again to allocate that 38,000, or are we thinking about maybe leveraging applications that were submitted previously and not funded for that?
My understanding is that we would be going out again, but that's a good question for Ira. I know he said he may be online.
I'm here if you need me to weigh in, Andrew.
And that's fine if we can answer later, but I just, because again, given the dollar amount,
Right.
I don't know the level of effort for the 38K, or if we already have a bunch of folks that applied through some earlier cycles and submitted, and we just want to reallocate to them. To those that weren't selected first rounds.
Those grants are relatively small,
Okay.
but impactful. So, I believe, as Andrew alluded to, I believe that the intent is to issue a brand new grant, based on a lot of the infrastructure that we've already built over the last couple of years. I think too that the goals might be a little bit different, right?
Okay.
So the and I don't mean to speak on behalf of HCD in this regard, but initially those small business grants were used to support businesses at the onset of the pandemic. And during recovery, I think the needs might have changed to some degree. And I think priorities of the city and HCD have also changed to some degree. And so I would expect that those dollars wouldn't just be kind of add-ons to the past programs, but they would be nuanced, some nuanced changes to existing programs, but for a new set of potential grantees.
Mhm. Okay, thank you. Councilmember DeVallo.
Yeah, and along those lines, the workforce programs have essentially not started, correct?
That's correct.
So I may be the only one who has this question. If we have a small business grant infrastructure in place and workforce development is a completely new thing, and we know we're trying to do too many little things. My question, again, not for right now, would be, would it make sense to consolidate?
I think the short answer is that the small business grant has been very successful.
Right.
And I think one of the things that Andrew's been suggesting, and is a lot of conversation with staff about the same, is that it'd be good to identify those successful programs and continue to support them. So
That's
it's-
a variation on what I'm saying,
yeah. So I think it there's a lot of efficiency associated with that, as well as a lot of agreement from staff. But of course, as with all of this, if council has a particular way in which you would like to see the remainder of these dollars allocated, we'll work from your guidance.
And that's not a decision we need to make right now because it's all within the ARPA budget. as far as the fiscal '24 budget goes, what we need to
Correct.
focus on is what you haven't even gotten to
Yeah,
yet.
right.
Through-
Next
but
slide.
Not your fault.
Yeah, next slide.
Next slide, next slide.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, Mayor.
Councilmember Small.
Oh, good. I thought you were trying to get out of here on this slide, man. I have another question about this particular $38,000 and its allocation with regard to the small business grants. In particular, there are some articulated spendings for Crossroads Development Authority, which I think are probably reasonable. But the concern I have, particularly since it's the economic engine of the personal property tax revenue that we do get. My question, though, is related to that because I'm curious about whether or not ARPA money would be able to be used for security funding or some sort of other cliff-based spending that in my mind would put some pressure on the landlords who operate those businesses in that area. Because the reality is that some of what we see as lags in service from our police department or other things, or anybody who's looking at the regular increase in police activities, some of those could be eliminated by a deterrent effect whereby landlords who are making a killing in passive money could be shown that securing their parcels would be a good idea. So I'm curious about whether or not that's a viable use of funds.
Yeah, I've never considered a purpose like that. It doesn't necessarily fall into the 7.5 million that needs to be specifically.
in that 38K.
Yeah, yeah. I could certainly get back to you on that question. Yeah, haven't heard of that.
Councilmember Honzak.
Yeah, I'm also interested in that line item. I guess particularly, I can almost count the small businesses in my ward, but they're very deeply meaningful to kind of that part of our city. And also, we've had so many empty business fronts along Flower Avenue for just really too long. I guess because I've seen just $1,000 here and $10,000 there go so far for some of those small businesses, and I can see the potential for more, I was rather dismayed to see the number going down to such a small number. And again, I will put this, now that I'm not on jury duty as of tomorrow, I will put this into a lengthy email with questions, but if you want to just speak to that a little bit more, I would be grateful about whether there's been a conversation. And I'm sorry if I missed that between all these things we've been talking about. I'm thinking that as we get to reconciliation, I'm feeling the urge to say something like, yes, please, could we hire a grants manager so that we can run some of these smaller programs, because such a small amount can just go such a long, long way.
I think I see Ira, who raised his hand. I thought I saw that on the Zoom.
Yeah, Madam Mayor, members of council, can you guys hear me? Okay,
Yes, we can.
wonderful. Yeah, I just wanted to jump in real quick and just give some context for that 38,000 if it's helpful. So just to remind everyone, this was a grant that we actually awarded kind of immediately after ARPA was approved, right at the tail end of FY22. We started getting this money out the door. These were individual grants to businesses. As you can see, about 150,000 in both FY22 and FY23 direct money to businesses. This 38,000 is because we actually allocated all of that, and there were certain awards that we weren't able to make because we weren't kind of provided the final information, or just things fell through with a business that got an award. So this is kind of that leftover pot that we certainly would love to continue awarding to businesses. We have both this money. We also have the big grant that we spoke of last week. From staff's perspective, anytime we can get direct capital in the hands of small businesses for the purposes of keeping their businesses operating, helping their businesses expand and stay in operation, that's a huge victory. So yes, certainly it's not a huge pot of money, but every little bit really helps when we get it directly into the hands of businesses themselves.
I just, I don't mean to push back, and I hope that I'm not. I think I'm sort of in the same area as you. But my argument on this subject is that if you look at the crossroads and who's spending money there and where those businesses are and how vibrant they relatively speaking are, even though the purple line is decimating their storefronts and whatever else, there is also a legitimate both perceived security concern but from other wards and the reality of the lack of real interjurisdictional cooperation in that area. And so the lags on the community there are that you have to be a certain kind of self-aware person who lives around diversity to feel comfortable there. And I'd argue that there's at least enough people in Tacoma Park who don't necessarily use either of those two services outside of the Taco Bell that enhancing the security profile of those businesses would perhaps even have a multiplier effect both for the community and for the economic benefits.
Appreciate the feedback and excited to kind of continue digging into this more. I'll point out real quickly, not in our budget, but Tacoma Langley Crossroads does have a security rebate program for some businesses, for property owners in the Crossroads. So there is a starting point for that, and certainly would love to dig into that further.
And I just say that, that to some degree has been very effective for the individual businesses, but we do have to some degree physical plant issues and other things related to the landlords over there that addressing some of these monies or things by throwing free money at them and then having it disappear may make them, more aware.
All right.
Yeah.
I think we can maybe get to the next slide.
Okay. Yeah, and just I think I already touched on this, but with the small business grants, the original council allocation all the way back in the the spending plan was adopted was $300,000 for this program and $150,000 spread over 2 years, and I'm sure it's just an award reality why those numbers ended up a little bit funky. All right, so I think this is a really important slide for FY24 council awareness and decision making. Number one is a point that of the 10.7 million of unspent ARPA funds heading into this fiscal year, there's really only a very, very small fraction of that you could technically call 100% obligated, already have a contract, already have an award. The remainder of that has some fungibility to it. This FY24 budget is really reflecting sort of those prior council decisions and the prior spending plan, and working within that. It's not a reinvent the entire wheel. It's which small tweaks to that spending plan. Of the 1.34 million that's going to be reallocated into the 1.1 million for CIP projects, document management overage, and the quality of life grants continuing into FY24. The way I've processed that is it's going to be reallocated from one of the very first slides I showed about an unencumbered balance. That's salary savings, that's the income from interest, that's the slight amount of additional award that we received that was unanticipated, and that's also cutting that financial software, $165,000 for that program. And you'll see from the unencumbered balance, the grants to nonprofits, that's that other slide, my least favorite slide we talked about earlier. Those are those programs, the catch-all grants to nonprofits, CP2 grants, the Spark. Again, that's really been reallocated to that the 110,000 for quality of life grants expanding into the future. The workforce development project, that's one that has not had the staff capacity to find a good funding source or program for, as well as potentially giving that money to county or other programs There's just a model that haven't sort of been able to fit at this time. Municipal broadband, that's that project again that had a $400,000 initial allocation, and is currently, there's a digital equity study that's going to allocate or provide recommendations for the $185,000 that remain in the budget for FY24, but there's also $185,000 that's being reallocated to support these reallocations. And then the final one is in the admin salary and benefits section for administrative staff. That's presupposing that all of those positions will be fully on board and funded at the highest benefit rate for those positions as of July 1, 2023. I don't think that that's particularly realistic. I also think that there may be other savings from other programs, for example, the interactive online budget tool. I think that may come under the projected amount, but that anticipated admin savings is making up the final difference between what's being reallocated and what's being deallocated. Future discussion, I have this on here. I know we touched on it a lot already tonight. But what the future of the direct cash assistance program looks like. My hope is to have a conversation, a inclusive conversation at that in an upcoming council meeting either in May or in June to talk about additional outreach initiatives that I've already touched upon tonight, as well as some alternative funding mechanisms if there's a certain plateau that we hit in terms of eligible households and applications, what to do with the balance of those funds. Those reallocated to other projects? Do they stay there? Are they reallocated to individuals who have already received assistance and received an award already? I've heard a number of residents reach out to me about that option, as well as whether there are income thresholds within that. I have the number here somewhere where if we were to stop the program today and we divided funds up equally from anyone who reported income under $30,000, that would be $792 to all of those already approved applicants. $792
Per?
per individual. If that's under 30,000. If it's under 20,000, it's closer to 1,000 to each. If it's under 10,000, it's 1,700. And if it's to anyone who's reported no income, it would be 2,800 to each. Again, we can have a more inclusive conversation about the future of that program. But as it currently stands, there's no reallocated funds getting pulled from that program. Same thing with the community connectors, which we talked about. And then also the Tacoma Langley Crossroads project, as well as the municipal broadband, what we're going to do with the balance of those funds once we have a chance to digest those studies and recommendations that come forward. So here's those next steps. Talk about some of the future of those programs, as well as what I talked about a little bit before with recreation scholarships and financial sustainability. If we would like to see those programs continue, and then again, where would the money come from at that point? And then I believe it's part of the adopted spending plan in the ordinance number 2022-3 for quarterly project updates. I think the last one occurred in January, so there should be another one upcoming. I think the January one was pretty high level. I think there was a more in-depth one last fall. And that's all.
All right, Councilmember DeBala.
Yeah, thank you, and I look forward to the in-depth discussion about some of that. I think I might have not understood the grant allocations. And maybe somebody just needs to write it down in another format. So here you're saying that you have a proposed reallocation of $220,000. And that is unspent money from fiscal '23 that's gonna be spent in '24 instead on grant programs? Or I've lost I've lost the track here of what's getting funded and what's not. in
Sure.
that-
So
in
I'll-
that
I'll-
section.
Yeah, so let me go back to that
Right, because
slide
you've got
from
workforce
earlier.
development, community connectors, and above that, you have 3 grant programs.
Right, so that's the top 3 grant programs
Right.
on this slide. So
Right.
grants to nonprofits, CP2 grants, and mini grants Spark.
And so we did not, maybe this didn't register when you were talking before. Are you saying that we did not do any grants to nonprofits or to food security or to mini grants in fiscal '23? That doesn't sound right.
Yeah, no, that's not correct. And I just want to make sure it's clear.
But the balance unspent. See, this
Yeah,
is what
so-
I'm not under, I'm
Yeah,
looking
it's-
at this.
So we spent overall, there were, I think, $2.8 million in grant spending in
Uh-huh.
FY '23.
Okay.
Those programs, emergency rental assistance, community quality of life grants, food insecurity RFP, the small business grants we talked about, recreation scholarships and tutoring. Those are, I think, the list that I have here. Public space management, which was a little bit different, but the neighborhood commercial center improvements as well.
So one of my questions, I thought I saw neighborhood commercial improvements in the general fund budget for fiscal '24.
That's correct. I think the funding for the ARPA portion of that program ended in FY '23.
Okay. Maybe I just need to study this, because I'm not understanding how you get $220,000 to reallocate.
The 220 is a combination of the CP2 grants, the Spark grants, and then the general category of grants to nonprofits. So the 3, if you look at the screen, the 3 programs at the top of this list.
Right.
There were dollars allocated for '23, no dollars spent. And so the total of that is 220, and the 220 has been reallocated for the purpose of, Andrew, if you could go to the last
No
slide.
dollars spent?
The 220 has been reallocated for the purpose of the green items in FY '24.
Maybe
Okay.
I just need to have somebody walk me through it later.
Yeah.
I'm still not getting it.
So, and I just want to make sure that, so the grants to nonprofits, right? And I'm looking at page 262 of the
Okay.
budget.
All right.
Right? So we had originally allocated $350K. We didn't spend any in FY '22. We budgeted, and fingers crossed, it looks like I can't get back to that slide, but we are planning to spend 130 for '23. We are allocating 110 for '24. That's 240K. We had earmarked 350K, so that means there's 110
All right.
that's
Okay.
missing, because we did not plan to obligate any dollars for this program in '25 and '26, which
Okay.
we could have allocated. So there's 110,000 that's kind of
Right.
left,
all
right?
So what I should be looking at is this piece of paper.
Correct.
To understand what we actually spent this year, what we are gonna spend in that program next year, and therefore what's left, because that's
Yes.
what I didn't understand.
Yes,
I'm
and
done.
also
I
it's.
got it. Thanks.
Yep,
Sorry
and
about
also
that.
it's really helpful because some programs, we are projecting to spend money in '25 and '26.
Right,
But some, we were
Not.
never planning
right.
to do that. So you have some programs, and I don't want to speak for the ARPA manager, but it sounds like we have some programs that did really well. And we spent that money really fast, and we're seeing the impacts of it, and maybe we want to look at the programs maybe that we haven't started just yet to see whether or not we want to move that money, or look at the programs that we've done, and if they've come in a little under budget, or maybe we want to reallocate, we can make some decisions around reallocation. And so, that for me in page 262 of the budget is the way that I can kind of see all of that in one place. So it's really more or less around crosswalking what is being discussed
Yeah, so I'm not
on
finding,
this slide.
I'm not finding mini grant Spark, but I'll.
Yeah,
find it.
what is, I couldn't find Spark either. What is the name, what is the ARPA name for the Spark grant? Was there a different name for that grant?
In most places, it's called Mini Grant Spark.
Mini Grant Spark. I don't know why I'm
I'm
not,
not seeing it either.
I'm not seeing it. So yeah, that is one that we would need to check. I'm not seeing it,
I don't think it's on
So-
the yellow page.
So that is included as part of the overall, and if you're looking at page 262, the grants to nonprofits, that's a catch-all for, and includes the Spark grant. And if you actually turn to page 262, I outlined the breakdown of those.
yes.
267 and 268. The general grants to nonprofit, CP2 grants.
Yeah.
Quality of life grants, mini grants, Spark.
Right, the
And the
several
recreation scene.
categories of.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you,
Okay, so that's helpful.
yeah.
It's my turn.
And,
All right.
and the reason that I'm just drilling in on this, even though it doesn't sound like a lot of money, is because when we did set up the original plan, we had a reason for wanting certain amounts of money front-ended for local grants to different groups, for food, for example. And they don't all run out to the full 5 years.
Right.
And here we are now, learned a lot in the last couple of years, time to maybe reshuffle the deck, that's fine. I just didn't understand how it matched up with the original, and I do now. Thank you for your patience.
Yeah. No, and you raised a really good point, because, grants to nonprofits, there are many other categories on this list of programs that are grants to nonprofits. And so, for example, food insecurity is not included in number 8 on page 267. That's just the way the spending plan initially was put together.
Okay.
So,
Councilmember DeBala, you have any other questions?
No,
Okay,
thank you.
perfect. Councilmember Small?
Thank you, Mayor. And I again wanted to say a couple of things. First of all, Mayor, your relative mastery of the ARPA allocations and the vision behind it is really admirable. I just wanted to tell you that. That being, and the professionalism of the staff with regard to being flexible about discussing these numbers, even though we're in sort of a time crunch of pragmatic realities, has really been amazing. So I just wanted to say, as someone who is on the other side of this thing, or sitting 9 inches lower, that sometimes, you get some administrative errors or whoop-de-doops on numbers, and I just appreciate how few there are. The one thing I did want to say about this, though, is that insofar as there are what I would consider some hodgepodgey spending patterns or goals in the previous statements of what was a previous council, I would just like to say on the record that I encourage the professional staff of the city to, be visionary and or apply best practices to a proposed reallocation of these funds, insofar as there are probably multiplier effects that could be had with this money for broader impact longer term. And it's not like I am at all against cash infusions to anyone, including myself or anybody. Like, it's always good for somebody to put some money in your pocket. But I don't necessarily think it's of value to be overly performative in doing that with what's left of this money, given the fact that, you're talking about $700,000 in inflationary dollars that, burn up for poor people. Like it's not like it's going to savings. It's not like there's like 15% coming in savings accounts, and so they're getting some sort of return on their money for having the money. And I just don't want anybody to think that we are doing some great beneficent thing by putting relatively small amounts of change in people's pockets, as opposed to making their community safer or allowing what is clearly a really dedicated professional staff to articulate some goal setting as per their, professions. So I just wanted to say that both to you, Mayor, and, Cindy, I really appreciate you digging in, just so you know. I appreciate it. It helps me, and it has to help people who are watching. But that being said, I would rather not be beholden to previous visions of how this extra money should be spent, particularly if there are all these sort of pregnant pauses and ellipses at the ends of some of these decisions. Thank you, Mayor.
Councilmember Honzak?
Well, with that said, I guess I'm feeling like a broken record, but I do have some concerns about even just my own ability to articulate. When we take $1.1 million and we reallocate it to capital improvement projects, I want to make sure that dollar for dollar I can say, and I have confidence that you guys are at least looking at this. I'd like to be able to see a clear articulation of what types of capital improvement projects and specifically where they are located in the city that are next in line. And if it's in here, pardon me for missing it. That's probably not in here. But I want to see, for example, if we're going to take 1.1 million that was meant for municipal broadband for poorer households that may have been actually obtained somewhat through excellent county programs, or may not have been, but it's been hard to get to those households, and we can't figure out a quick way to do that in the time we have, then I want to see it go towards ADA compliant sidewalks in Ward 6 where they don't exist and they've been held off for a long time. I want to see it go towards pit holes in the roads in places where they typically haven't gone, where there may not be a bunch of people petitioning for it, but where it is desperately needed. That is what I want to see. And I have every confidence that the city staff shares those values with us, but it is only ethical and right that we do that if we're not able to deliver the urgent money that was needed and still probably is, but the urgent services and or needs that we were attempting to address through the ARPA funding, that we put it directly into services that will serve those people who have been hit the hardest. Thank you.
Director Braithwaite, can you speak to the feasibility of being able to kind of earmark those dollars to a specific ward?
Sure, and excuse me, I've provided some information. I don't know if it's got sent to council yet. The ADA maps and the street
Not yet.
restoration. So there'll be information spreadsheets that are coming to you that give specific information. For instance, this 1.1 in CIP, as you mentioned, 750,000 of that is allocated towards sidewalks, which include 300,000 for new sidewalks and traffic calming, 300,000 for ADA work on city sidewalks, and 150,000 for ADA on state highway. That said, when we look at our street restoration fund, as I'd mentioned before, we do it based on pavement condition. So you'll have in front of you our recommendations for the streets that are pavement related in order for FY24 and FY25. So you'll have that list in front of you shortly, and you can look and see where those streets are. So we don't determine where money's being spent on street allocation based on ward per se. We're doing it based on pavement condition. For the new sidewalk and traffic calming, that of course is a community-based process that the city engages neighborhoods in. So it's based on whatever project is currently in the queue. Right now, What we anticipate for FY24 is a project on Belford Place. If it gets approved by the community, we're well underway in a sidewalk design process there. And there's a potential traffic calming project that I'm aware of in the 7500 block of Jackson Avenue. We have outstanding projects on Kansas Avenue and on 7900 block of Maple Avenue.
What do you
Tho-
mean by outstanding?
Pardon me?
What do you mean by outstanding?
They've been in place for a very long time, and there's a whole assortment of community and other reasons why they haven't been
Okay.
moved, but they are sort of still there waiting. So it's based on, prior work and a queue. For the ADA work, as you know, we've been doing this since 2010, so we're about 86% through the city. So all the Ward 6 sidewalks have been made ADA compliant. All except a portion of Ritchie Avenue and a section of Maple Avenue in Ward 4 have been made ADA compliant. In Ward 5, all the sidewalks in Ward 5 have been made ADA compliant. So we won't be able to direct it towards there, though when you get this map that we've created, you'll see where the remaining ADA sidewalks are. For city roadways, a very small number of existing streets, but you'll be able to see where those are. State Highway, it's a little bit more of a wide open territory because we've just started doing ADA on State Highway and the funding has been limited year to year. So there's very few state highway sidewalks that we've been able to do. So I don't know if that gets at your question. I understand your goal. The way those particular programs are functioned and directed, we can certainly take a look at making sure we've addressed streets and sidewalk issues in those wards, but for the most part, particularly for the ADA compliance on city sidewalks, we have. Those have been done. Actually, Ward 1 is the area where we have the most sidewalks to do that we haven't done ADA compliance on.
So I'm gonna be frank. Then I'm not very comfortable with this reallocation. I'm gonna need to give it some more thought. I'm disappointed to hear that's. I just can't take, $300,000 that was intended for small grants to go to people who really have been heavily impacted by the pandemic and say that we're going to put it into sidewalks. That might be just a due for terms, partially because I haven't fully perceived that, for example, our traffic calming procedures have been designed around equity. And that's a problem as I see it, but it's a longer term thing to solve, and we're not going to solve it before budget season. But anyway, somehow I don't have the answer, but I'm not comfortable. Thanks. Sorry. But I appreciate you sharing that. And ADA compliance is for me also a major priority, and that affects our disabled population and others. So there is some of that in my mind, but I just think we need to think a little bit more carefully about the values we're reflecting here. Thanks.
Councilmember DeBala.
Yeah, and along those lines, I have some questions about the reallocation also. And one of them is, if we funded the neighborhood commercial improvements out of ARPA money this year, I'm still struggling with why would we fund it out of general fund money next year, but then have to transfer money to side, wouldn't it be simpler to just put 100,000 more in here, assuming we wanted to continue the neighborhood commercial improvements, and move less out of ARPA into the regular general fund?
More or less, it's the movement of money out of the general fund is an attempt to accommodate the larger challenge, which is balancing the budget.
Yeah.
So, the rationale for not including the neighborhood commercial improvement dollars is, I think, simply that there was no more money allocated in FY24 for that purpose.
Right.
We very well could have, moved it from one pot to another, and I think probably I guess perhaps shown some continuity in that regard. A part of the, I think the staff rationale for the 1.1 million in CIP is that they are large chunks of money
Yeah.
that are easily identifiable.
Right, I get that.
And you can, you can move it in mass. The alternative is trying to find smaller allocations within the general fund
Right.
and, come up with $1.1 million worth of stuff to include that could be moved from general fund to the other fund.
Right.
So in a lot of ways, it's for simplicity's sake.
Yeah,
We
and
very
I-
well could go, again, we could very well go through the budget, identify other programs and projects, but the outcome is
Is
more or
the-
less the same. It's,
Right.
we're moving general fund monies to ARPA.
Yeah, and I appreciate that you're working under very tight time constraints and without the benefit of this whole conversation of where the current council members are, not just the folks who were involved in the initial ARP allocation. So I get all that. I'm just saying at this point, maybe that's something we think about.
So I do want to piggyback on Councilmember DeBala's point. And I know that I before the meeting, we had kind of talked about, can we look at the sidewalks through a racial, like a racial equity lens and really try, I was talking to Andrew before y'all
Yeah,
got
but
here.
everybody seems to be thinking.
So we're thinking along the same lines. But one of the things that I know I might have mentioned early on with the ARPA funds was no dollar left behind. So I also, no dollar left behind. And so I also am very cognizant of the fact that where we are right now, we're talking about FY '24 dollars, and there, my gut and many years of working for the federal government, people are ready to sweep. And so if we can make sure that even if we go down this path of identifying smaller programs, we have to make sure we have the staff capacity to spend it. And it has to be spent. And so where I would like for us to be able to look at, and I really want to push on this, for us to look at CIP projects through a racial equity lens. I do understand that CIP is a quick way to make sure that we're not left with $1 million if we're unable to push out some of these smaller grants. So that's another aspect of the trade-off, besides, making sure that the money, like the programs, it's just a matter of switching out the funding sources for a number of programs that we have in our budget. But for me, it's also about, is it an allowable expenditure under ARPA, which it is? Can we make sure that we're able to get the dollars obligated, get the money spent, and the work done within the timeframes that we've been allotted by the federal government? And so that, for me, is another thing to consider. Councilmember Small.
Yeah, I just wanted to say a couple things. Number one, I feel like we should have a table for the staff when we do these, because it's not really fair for you to have to stand up this whole time. But yeah, notwithstanding that, the thing that I did want to talk about is probably a more specific, I don't know, recitation of what I think is has been my point for a while, and that is that as far as I'm concerned, from the perspective of Ward 6 residents, there have been long-term intractable problems with regard to any number of things. Let's talk, streets, that have yet to be resolved. And given the fact that those are long-term problems, that may or may not have a multiplier effect for generations afterwards, like we won't have babies getting hit by cars, for example. I'm curious about whether or not the city is actually thinking or using this opportunity as the opportunity that it may be to do some hard sunk cost type philosophical spending. Like insofar as like there are things that economies of scale, however you want to look at it in traditional parlance. But it would seem like there's a nexus there where if we're talking about equity issues, and we're looking at socioeconomic equity or racial equity or some version thereof, and or we're talking about densities and populations or civic or census information, you're going to end up in 3 places essentially, and as a place where people have been very willing to articulate their concerns about not spending money, it would seem that this is an opportunity for the staff to profess as professionals what needs to happen. And to me, from my experience doing this from January or so to now, I feel like the staff, generally speaking, has been handcuffed or required to work to rule to some degree by these institutional codified patterns. And I don't think it's fair to the staff, because people light the staff up, or people come and send emails to us about how could you or how dare you or whatever else. And there's not the flexibility necessary for real professionals to do their jobs. And so as we start thinking about how we're going to reallocate these large chunks of money, and this, we're talking $1.3 million essentially, it would seem that it is an opportunity for people who have been professionals at this level to implement best practices. In addition, it would seem like it would be a really good value add or multiplier to find organizations or other sorts of projects in hand where you can sign a contract with somebody and make sure X, Y, or Z is occurring. And given the fact that this is ARPA money and is different in kind than all of the codified spending that we previously did, I would argue that David and you and the rest of the staff really do have an opportunity here to do something that you have been hindered from doing, at the same time as you have all of these people trying to get you to not do anything at all. And that's what I have to say about this. And I hope that somewhere along the lines of continuing to harp on the fact that by and large, people on this board don't know the jobs. It's not fair to you guys for either us or people who aren't paying attention to these issues to come in here and tell you what to do. I would be really excited to see something where you guys had the hope and opportunity of doing something related to being a public service in a place that is supposed to be intentional about a lot of these issues. Like we could, notwithstanding the parties and whatever else, this is a nonpartisan place where we have the opportunity for people who want to do these things to have a chance to do them. And I'd like to be supportive of those things. So I just wanted to say that out loud again on the record. I feel like the staff has been hindered by previous decisions, quasi-socialist bureaucratic nonsense that don't allow for people to shine.
So I just want to make sure I understand, Director Braithwaite, around what we are going to be provided in terms of the CIP plan. So is it, thank you.
We'll have a list of roadways that are eligible for restoration based on pavement condition. And we will show what our first draft at what we would do in FY24 should nothing else change, no new utility project, no new state highway something or other. And just, by way of looking at it really quickly, there's streets in Ward 2, which used to be Ward 6, Kentland, Hopewell, Larch.
Yes,
We just
and that is
started our
desperately
sidewalk
needed.
project, so it's perfect timing to follow that up with a road restoration project afterwards, because we do mess up the roads when we're doing sidewalk projects. Street in Ward 5, which is Houston Avenue, a section of that. 2 sections of the New Hampshire Avenue Service Road, one in Ward 6, one in Ward 3, and then Sligo Mill and a section of Sheridan Street, which is in Ward 3. So those are the roadways based on pavement condition that would be, and also based on the reduced amount of allocation. You know, we had originally had a $500,000 list that got reduced to $350,000. So it's slightly more than that, but that's an assumption about what you'll see in this first round of information you'll have about streets. And then, this is not a good version, but you'll have a map that shows you all the sidewalks in the city where we've done ADA compliance work, and then a highlighted section, 2 different colors, one that shows the remaining ones on city streets, one that shows the remaining locations on state highways. And you'll sort of be able to see everything that's done and where things remain. And again, a lot of that will depend on funding allocations. We're now looking at the 150 for state highway and 300 for city sidewalks. So we'll come up with a plan based on those amounts of funding. If it changes, then obviously we'll change the remainder. But you'll see there, we've got, 14% of the city sidewalks left to do, and you'll see exactly where they are and where they've already been done.
Great. Thank you so much. Councilmember Honzak?
Yeah, I just want, excuse me, thank you for sharing that, Daryl. I'm looking at just what Mayor Searcy just said, as well as my colleague Small, and I'm thinking, indeed, this is an opportunity, and some of the work that I've done in my career, one of the things that can be really hard to do, and I can see it already in our city, is it can be very hard to have funding and or a mandate to go to do work, to do work cross-departmentally. And this is a really exciting pot of funding in that it gives potentially the opportunity to tackle something that's not compartmentalized to a department, and kind of innovation, if you will, across the city to say, hey, we don't normally have these dollars. What could we do with them? I mean, I guess it's just a call to say that might be an interesting way to engage staff actually in how they might re-envision this $1.1 million. But anyway, I want to be clear that my request was not, in my mind, a ward-centric request, for sure. It is a call to look, as Mayor Searcy said, at the CIP through a racial equity lens, an ADA lens, and a socioeconomic lens. And I would really love to see that list that you've just provided to us clearly articulate those 3 lenses. My colleagues may have more to add to that, but before I would be comfortable as a council saying, yes, I'm comfortable that we're going to reallocate that 1.1 million, I would definitely want to see that maybe superseding some of our existing policies right at this moment for the ARPA dollars, because I think that is the purpose and the intention of the previous council and the funding itself. So that would be my proposition, and if I need to do that in the form of some other more formal form later, I would want to do that. Thank you.
I will just say to your question, Councilmember Honzak, I think that a lot of the data that could help with supporting that decision may already be available on our website. So once we know what the streets and the locations are, I believe, and staff can correct me if I'm wrong, that there were some prior maps and data that was made available around income and the like that could be used to cross-check in terms of where those things are. So it might be, I don't know to what extent we have the ability of staff to kind of do some of that cross-pollination for us. But I do think that there is some data that may be available on our website with our maps that might enable us to kind of take a look at the address of where, or the streets that are being proposed, and see some of the census data, see where some of the speed humps and prior traffic calming has happened, see some of that stuff that might help us to kind of make some determinations as to whether or not, yes, this is in a location that makes sense for us and our values with the ARPA dollars. Another thing that I do want to stress to my colleague, I hear that there's a lot of desires of staff to be creative and ambitious and the like, but we also told them to be cost frugal, right? We told them, don't be creative, don't come up with new stuff we can't pay for, right? So it is important that when we are looking at the budget, that we recognize that we're at a point in the process where the decision-making is ours. We can ask staff to provide us with information to help us with better understanding and informing our decisions, but the decisions are ours. So if there is a desire for something to be used, the ARPA dollars to be used for another purpose, then that would be something that would need to be proposed as part of the reconciliation process. So as we are getting ready to embark on reconciliation, if there are things that you see as gaps or things that we would like to make sure that we're allocating money towards, those are the things that would need to be brought up during the meeting starting on Wednesday as items that would need to be fleshed out. Councilmember Siemens?
Mayor, may I follow up on that? Just with a question, and it occurred to me as I was sitting here listening to all this discussion on ARPA, and I know that our acting city manager has put together the draft budget and made some adjustments, suggested adjustments to the ARPA funding. But there's a whole lot to this whole discussion that I'm not sure we have enough time to do, as you said, to just say, well, let's put that on the reconciliation list. There are some things that are pretty obvious that we want to do and we want to make. But I'm wondering if it wouldn't be a viable and prudent thing to just have a bucket on the side that we say, okay, we know we'd like to take this money out of ARPA for the thing it's designated for right now, but we'd like to put it into this undesignated ARPA money pile and leave it at that when we get to the approving the budget. And then after the budget's been approved, we can go into more in-depth discussion and make sure we do have all the data we need and make sure that we do recognize all the different interests that council members have, and then make a decision with a budget amendment later that takes that undesignated ARPA money and get it designated in a reasonable period of time, not wait till FY 26 or something, but get it done, because I think it's just unrealistic and overwhelming to try to get that all done before we approve this budget.
So thank you so much, Councilmember Siemens. That is an option, and we have taken that approach to budgeting in the past, where we've just kind of identified, okay, these are holes, and we'll figure out what to do later, or this is an earmark, and we'll figure out what to do later. So that is an option that we can propose as part of, again, it would still need to be proposed as part of the reconciliation. And something that we can clearly communicate as part of our budget resolution of what we would like, or the timeframes in which we would like for those dollars to be obligated and a plan put in place for them. So that is an option, yes. And I'm sorry, I'm gonna try to go because I see everyone's lights. So if folks can bear with me, I'm just gonna go through the order in which the lights are up. Councilmember DeBala.
So in that spirit, I think that Andrew has already suggested that we, for lack of a better term, we have a bucket of cash assistance, what community connectors, Crossroads, if there's gonna be extra money for any of them, let's not beat that one to death tonight, but say that's within a bucket within ARPA that's potentially available for something else. Two things. We didn't talk about moving some of the direct cash assistance money. You did tell us what it would be like if we just divided by the number of people. And I do believe there's some pockets of the city, perhaps in Ward 5, that could benefit from a little more outreach. But overall, I think we might have run that one pretty much as far as it's gonna go. And so I would be open to reallocating some portion of that, not all of it, on the theory that we're never gonna spend $870,000 more. And we might, as I think Councilmember Small said earlier, use that money more quickly and more usefully in another ARPA program. So I'm just putting that out there. Was that the thing that was actually the one thing I was gonna say. Yeah, that was it. Thank you. I don't have a dollar amount in my head yet, but I would be interested to hear what other people have to say about that.
Councilmember Fulcher.
I just want to make sure that I understand everything on page 12 no longer has any funding in the 2024 budget, correct?
Page 12. Is it this one?
Yes.
No, not everything. So food insecurity RFP, that just, what this slide really is only trying to convey is that these were successful projects that are currently ongoing or completed. So I'm trying to think, the recreation STEAM program is completed in FY23. Food insecurity RFP, and I apologize, you kind of have to cross-reference it with the 5-year spending plan a little bit. But that would be, that's 90,000 that's to be spent in FY24 and 70,000 in FY25 for that program. The community quality of life grants that will continue into FY24 at the same funding level. Emergency rental assistance is $250,000 next year. Recreation scholarships and tutoring that does go into FY24 at $150,000.
Okay.
Multifamily housing rehabilitation, that's also $500,000 in FY24. So a good number of these programs are actually continuing
Okay.
into the future.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Councilmember Gibson.
Thank you. On that same page, if I'm not mistaken, the public space management plan had 30K.
Your microphone is off, Councilman.
No, it's, I believe the public space management plan had 30K designated for 24. Is that? I'm not sure where I see that, where I see it. It
That
is
wasn't
it
ARPA
is
money.
continued.
That wasn't ARPA money that you're referring to. That, the public space management plan implementation is in the CIP, but it's not funded via ARPA.
It's in CIP. Okay, I got a little confused there. Just the philosophical questions, and I want to thank Councilmember Siemens. Yeah, it's a lot of decisions, and sometimes we don't have all of the data to make those decisions. In terms of roadways, Daryl was kind enough to get me a list of that, and so I went driving and looking at those roads. And I would encourage you to go down to those streets and see if they are a priority or not. I went and looked at the ones across, I guess it was Kentwood, and I saw that there's sidewalks going on. It made all kinds of sense that needed to be done. On Sligo Mills, I said that could wait a couple of years. Yeah, I mean, I think there is competing values here. We've got frugality has been mentioned. We want to save money not only for the taxpayers, but also to do it for those programs, those projects, those people that need it most. And so I am interested in keeping as much of the ARPA money as possible to be used for those projects that really need to be done and for the people and populations that most need it. So I am willing to see some reductions in the CIP, and the neighborhood connectors is something that I'm interested in, and I think I'll need to learn more about these other programs which have been kind of put on hold, but I'm certainly open to doing that. And as Councilmember Small said, we should not be held hostage to previous agreements or previous interpretations of what we need when. So I look forward to to moving forward and making the best decisions as we can. And I do like the idea of having some undesignated funds when we're not sure what to do, but we don't want to take it out of ARPA. We don't want to designate it someplace else. So I think we'll do the best that we can, but appreciate the presentation and the diligence. I don't need to say it. You guys are just doing a good job. Thank you.
Thanks, Randy. I appreciate that.
Councilmember Honzak.
Thank you to all my fellow council members and to you. I just want to echo Councilmember DeBala, your your thoughts on the direct cash assistance. What might be, once we really try to make sure we do that last push, please hold out for the June 3rd event in Ward 5, in which we hope to, that's one of the purposes of that event, is to try to really get the word out, and plus then the follow-up that would need to happen after that. But that we could think of that potentially as our some of our contingency funding. I'm hearing city staff and good reason from our mayor about the fact that it's very efficient to reallocate these funds to large pots of money that can be obligated quickly. Our burn rate is a really important, our obligation rate, let's call it in this case. Obligation rate and burn rate are very real if we don't want to lose these dollars, particularly in light of what's happening at the federal level. So I do support that. I guess I just want to reiterate. So therefore, council member, I'm going to call you Terry because I'm just blanking. Thank you. Anyway, yes, Mr. Terry, Mayor Terry, Deputy Mayor. I'm not sure if it would be wise for us as council to maybe set up such a large contingency fund, given that we really need to obligate. At least that's what I'm hearing from staff pretty quickly in order to make sure we hold on to these funds. But I guess I just want to reiterate that I'd rather not take a look at the data and retro justify what we've put on our plan, but rather take the data and look at what we've got, the longer list than what you've actually got there with the dollar value that added up to the bottom based on our current criteria. But to take some data and looking at the macro level, look at the list of, I don't know, maybe 50 things that you've got, and some arbitrary amount that's longer, and take a set of those three. And again, like I said, my council members may have another thing, but not a really complex thing. But look at those three, say, criteria, not about wards, about data, really the micro data on where those various projects might impact populations, and skip through the list in a way that we would not normally use for our standard business as usual city practices. And that, to me, would be a very reasonable way to justify the reallocation of this particular pot of funding. That's what I'm suggesting.
Councilmember, can you give us a little more guidance there? What type of data would we use to justify the sidewalk projects? So there's the condition data that we have, and not just sidewalks. I mean our infrastructure projects. There's condition data, and so would the additional, I assume, equity-like or demographic data be on top of the condition data, or what do you envision the process?
Well, so
you've
got. I know that, as I understand it, Director Braithwaite and all these CIP projects, as I understand, are under Public Works at the moment. So take that longer list, and then that already exists. It's already inclusive of indices for condition, et cetera. So it's known that these things are needed, and then to take three sets of socioeconomic data and racial equity data and ADA compliance, and take those three sort of preconditions and ask the questions either of each line item, or lay it over the top and say, based on this, we're looking at these general geographies, which might actually be a sub-slice of any given ward in this city, not a whole ward is not what I'm saying. I'm saying really look down at some of those layers from our, you could do one layer on socioeconomic and then say, where is this particular project going to fall with, if I'm looking at those three layers, socioeconomics, you know, what about this particular street? I mean, I suspect that Director Braithwaite, she's nodding her head. I'm thinking she may have a vision that aligns with that. And maybe it doesn't make sense, but that's what I'm a data person. It makes sense to me from a map perspective and or from an index.
Yeah.
An index could be run.
If you look at the socioeconomic data that we have, and there is maps on the city's website, there's very little areas of the city that say, for instance, fall within CDBG, which is one socioeconomic indicator. So it really, the only CDBG areas that are included now are a section of Ward 4, Little Corner, Ward 6 up top, and Ward 5. So it eliminates the entire rest of the city. So we would have a hard time, for instance, the State of Maryland Department of Environment economic justice indicators doesn't include anything in the city. So we fall out of their box altogether. So we'll really have to be creative at figuring out which socioeconomic, where it is. And I don't know, maybe the planning office has some that I'm not aware of. At this point, all I know is the CDBG and the economic justice.
There are proxies that I'm sure, I mean, again, I'm not looking, you guys know this data. In fact, actually probably, Manager Eubanks, you probably know this data pretty well for the housing department. But I would imagine just looking at I assume you have some sort of geo-referenced database that shows the number of multifamily residential units on any given street. Or something like that could be used as a proxy for socioeconomic data that we may not have at that micro level. And again, I'm sorry if this sounds overly complex. That is not my goal. In fact, I'm thinking of something fairly generic that would just allow us to really show that we've done this in that kind of an order versus the standard business as usual. That's what I'm thinking. And yeah, you're looking at me like, no.
Well,
we can talk about this later. I don't know that we have to use this time for this. This is just, it's a general proposition.
Yeah, I think this is something that could be perhaps better addressed offline. I will say this to echo Director Braithwaite's point. The city of Tacoma Park includes a lot of individuals who really want to help people in need. But the data is starting to show that they don't live here necessarily. And so there aren't as many people who would be eligible for certain things based on certain income requirements as some may think. For instance, when it came to direct cash assistance, one of the major issues when I talked to folks at CHEER who were going out, particularly in Ward 5, was the fact that people who lived on the other side of Flower, which is not in the city of Tacoma Park, were eligible, but they lived outside of the city limits. So I do think that while we have a number of individuals that are in need, we get the calls every day, we really try to do the best that we can. Demographically, our community is becoming more affluent. And that means that there are certain segments of our community, the segments of our community that historically, and I will say Ward 6, when I first moved into the neighborhood, is totally different from what I see now. So we have to keep that a little bit in the backs of our minds when we are talking about, how we're allocating. So there are data that's available on the city's website, the Data Explorer, and there's a couple of other data sources that are available that kind of highlight this point. But Daryl is correct. I've looked at this multiple times. There's a little bitty corner of Ward 6. I know because my house is in that little corner. That is still CDBG eligible. Ward 5 is, but it's dwindling. It used to be most of Ward 6 was included, but now it's not. So as we are starting to see the transformation of our community, it may mean to that point of what are some of the things that we want to consider, we may just need to be more creative around how we want to target, even if it means like income thresholds for retirees and things like that. We just have to think about it differently. So I don't want to belabor the point, but I do just think it's important to make people aware that that data is available on our website, and you will see what staff is sharing in terms of the data that's available.
May I just
yeah, sure.
respond? With all due respect, Mayor, I totally hear you, and I am concerned about data availability. It's something, I really appreciate. I just, there are large pockets of Ward 5, and I'm sure probably of Ward 6, but I don't know Ward 6 as well, but there are large pockets of Ward 5 that most definitely are not following that trajectory. There are lines of people so long on the food banks right in front of my house twice a week, every morning. And also I see the people walking in the northern part of my ward. A lot of these populations are not getting the attention that they need from the city. They are not even engaging with the city in any way. And I am very concerned. That $60,000 threshold is a lot of people didn't apply for the cash assistance, not because, because they are just above that or they have larger households. So, I struggle to, those cutoffs which are used by the county and by the state for various purposes are not very good indicators of where people are actually living at. They're living, between 60 and 100 right now with a household of 4 people is not very comfortable. Anyway, and I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Councilmember
If I may
Singh.
follow up on that. Just to put this in perspective, that according to the 2016 self-sufficiency standard from Montgomery County, it costs about $91,200 for a 4-person family with 2 working parents, a preschooler, and a school-aged child to afford the basic necessities in the county. Okay, so when we're talking about disparity, it doesn't mean that they're sitting there with absolutely no income. I think it's important to keep in mind that people in need often make what we used to think was a whole lot of money.
I just echo what Terry said insofar as, the reality also is that, there are populations that don't get a chance to articulate their preferences or opinions about lots of these issues because they don't get home till 7:30 or 8 because they're not on the top of the totem pole with regard to making those kinds of decisions. And so there are some, latent realities in certain populations, at least in Ward 6. One of the things is people don't have time, so they appreciated the fact that you were conscientious in the way that you were, and they appreciate the fact that I'm conscientious in the way that I am because they don't have time.
Right.
And so.
Yep. But again, I don't want to belabor it, but I just bring up the data to show that we have to think differently, especially and who we're thinking about when we are talking about residents in need in our community and when we're establishing certain thresholds for programs and the like and what requirements are. It may be that we have to do it a little different in terms of increasing income eligibility requirements and things like that. Councilmember Fulcher?
Once again, I'm new here. On page 4, the 1.19 million in revenue loss, was that a number that was come up with because that was what we actually thought the revenue loss was? And did that take into account other monies that we spent out of the general fund in order to address COVID issues that were going on at the time?
So my understanding is that the total calculation that was done at the time was a number much higher than that, probably closer to 3 to 4 million in terms of revenue lost as a result of the pandemic. So that was just an FY22 decision to bridge a funding gap.
I do think it's really important to help the vulnerable people in our community, but I also just want to point out that the city did take a huge hit during COVID. And that money was also supposed to be to help our city. And so I do feel comfortable taking some money and putting it towards the city as that money was intended to be done.
Yeah, thank you. And I just, if my memory serves me correctly, part of the challenge with knowing how much money we could earmark for lost revenues was the fact that we didn't have a lot of guidance from the Treasury at the time.
Right.
And so a lot of that was coming out quite,
As we-
it was trickling in.
I'm not hating you guys, like, really, it's a conscientious effort. It's just
Yeah.
like, maybe we should do something different.
Yeah. I hear you, and you bring up a really good point, Councilmember Fulcher. The requirements changed, guidance became clearer, and we may need to rethink our perspective on the lost revenues and whether or not we want to figure out how to better make sure that we're meeting the needs, the base needs of the city, and making ourselves whole. Councilmember Gibson.
I got, that's an interesting, a valuable point to bring up. The loss of, I guess you say something like 3 to 4 million might have been lost revenue. That's taking into account this, both the pluses and minuses during that time, because there were some savings, but we've also gotten 17 million ARPA money, and of that, 10 million is what we have greater latitude to use, and we've used a significant amount of that already. I just think that we need to look forward, and I think look forward in terms of where our needs are at. And I want to now return back to the question of who's feeling the pain and where the pain is being felt and how we use this ARPA fund. And I think that the discussion about thresholds, we could certainly go to our property tax threshold, and that's one of the things that I will be proposing, that we at least cover that. And it's such a low threshold as it is. We reduced the amount that we had allocated for the property tax credit, and if we increase our taxes, they need to keep up with that. And there was a document that started with a conversation that Cindy and I made with the staff with regard to who is eligible and how many might be more eligible in terms of property tax credits. And there was 97 homeowners took advantage of the property tax credit last year, but the staff, I think, calculated something either 2 to 4 times that people would be eligible at these very, very low levels. And they may be in Ward 2, they may be in Ward 3, 4. There are individuals that are hurting as well as pockets of poverty. So I think we need to look at both.
Okay, Councilmember DeBala.
So, in potential conclusion,
Please.
so what we need to decide in the next little bit is the interchange between the ARPA, the general fund, the CIP. Not necessarily all the details with ARPA. So for purposes of the budget, I guess I'm asking if this is right. For purposes of the budget that we are working on right now for fiscal '24, what we need to know, bottom line, is how much of this ARPA money is being used either in CIP or in general fund. And your all proposal is to take what 0.1 million of the ARPA for several specific uses in the CIP. So putting all of this, I love talking about the ARPA program because you do get to be a little more creative. But putting this all in perspective, the immediate discussion is the 1.34 million reallocation. I said 1.1, but this says 1.3.
1.1 going to
Go,
It's
what's
1.1
1.1?
going to CIP. Yep.
Yeah. Okay, so have I got that? Is that basically right?
Yes.
Okay, just to focus everybody.
Yep, just to focus everyone, the big question is, are we, amongst the many, are there thoughts, concerns around the staff proposal to reallocate the 1.34 million and where those dollars were reallocated from were, consolidations of the programs that are noted in light orange below. Another point, again, for future discussion, we don't have to do it today, but it is something that we may want to make sure that we earmark appropriately in the budget, are those other, if there are any thoughts regarding the other programs that are listed under future discussion. If we include, for example, direct cash assistance at 870,000 in the budget, then folks are going to work towards that, right? So for those items that are in the future discussion territory, if there are any thoughts regarding those amounts that folks want to put on the table, or say, no, I'm perfectly fine with keeping them where they are, but that's helpful to know as well as we're talking about the budget. And if we want to make certain decisions around earmarking a dollar amount to reallocate based on how this council sees fit, that's appropriate. But it is important for folks to know that those are the main buckets of decision-making that needs to happen.
Okay,
Andrew,
so-
I think we can target the 1.3 even more, right? I think it's really the 1.1
Yeah,
that
I
is,
was just
that is
gonna
budgeted.
say
Yeah,
that.
yeah, the 1.1 directly impacts the tax rate,
Right.
which you'll be setting. The rest of it is fungible over time. You can decide next week, next council meeting, at any time to amend that as you see fit.
Okay.
So that, yeah, so to highlight it, that really is the key decision point as it relates to the FY24 budget.
Okay. All right. Any other?
I'm not
Yes.
clear. I'm sorry. I'm not clear on whether we're making, I understand we need to make a decision about CIP because it impacts the funding that we'll be discussing. Are we making a motion tonight to say yes or anything like that to the ARPA portion of our budget? Or how does that part work with the
Nope.
next two stages we're going to go through?
The ARPA budget is part of our overall budget.
Right.
So it would be voted on after we do all of the reconciliation as part of our overall budget. So basically what would happen is over the course of reconciliation, as we are talking about different projects and things and where we want to move them in terms of ARPA or not, then we would get the final ARPA budget as part of our overall budget. So for example, let's say we decide, I don't want to use 1.1 for CIP. Well, if we still want to fund 1.1, that has to come out of the general fund, right?
Right.
And then we would have to figure out how to move stuff around. But that would have a direct impact on what our general fund budget would look like, as well as our ARPA budget. So it's all part of the same vote and discussion, if that makes sense.
But we can't, besides the CIP portion, for example, we wouldn't be going through ARPA again in this kind of depth when we going through the reconciliation, is that right? So for example, if I wanted to focus on community connectors or something like that, we wouldn't be having that conversation again. Is
You
that
could.
correct? Oh, we could.
You
Okay.
could. So let's
Because
say.
it's all integrated into the larger budget.
Because it's all
Okay.
part of the
Okay.
larger
I'm
budget.
just trying to be clear on that when we go through reconciliation, or if this is our last chance to,
No.
okay, okay, thank you.
No worries.
So, for example, does somebody need to make well, no, you don't have to put it on the reconciliation list because it's already in the budget that the
Correct.
130,000 is in extras for document management. Because that's already in your proposal.
Correct, yep.
But and I don't disagree, but let's say I did.
Yeah.
I would say, take that $130,000, I don't want to spend it on document management, I want to put on the reconciliation list, subtract that out of that part of ARPA, and add it to community connectors.
Right. Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah, you absolutely.
that is also part of the reconciliation, but the real important part is the interplay between the funds.
Right.
Yes.
Correct,
And my
yeah.
understanding is for the future discussion, there would need to be an amendment to whatever's approved as a part of the budget process.
Yeah, I
Yes.
think, yeah, it could go a couple of different ways. It could be part of the first budget amendment and for FY24. I also think that it could be an amendment to the ordinance, the original spending plan ordinance, to sort of have a more comprehensive overview and outlook at what the future of ARPA program should be for anything that's unspent. up to that date.
So for the budget, we focus on these 3 items. If there are changes outside of or that need to happen after the approval of the budget, then we would have a separate process to discuss that, and then the mechanism for changing those numbers.
Yeah.
But I do just want to triple check, right? So, and whether or not we need to, as part of the budget reconciliation process, if there are, let's say, for example, the quality of life grants, someone says, I don't want to fund it, but I don't know where I want the money to go. So there's just a reduction in the ARPA budget of $130,000. But because it's ARPA,
It goes into contingency?
you eventually have to figure out where you want that money to go.
Yeah.
Right? And so that would need to be something that would still need to be accounted for as part of reconciliation, because those would be dollars, ARPA dollars, that we would have to re-obligate at a different time, at a later, either through the budget process or at a later time.
Yeah, yeah, or at a later time. I don't think it would have to occur during reconciliation, but, I mean, there are, as you can see in the 5-year spending plan, there's a good amount that's unobligated at this particular phase
Yeah,
in
we
the,
really
in
need
the
to get
plan.
on it.
So,
It's-
yeah, that decision can occur then.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
Councilmember Gibson?
Yeah, just one other hypothetical. So, again, if we were to want to do more with the ARPA funds and take that out of, reduce the CIP 1.1, then the choice is either we have to, let's say we take out 1 million or 100,000 out of the CIP when we want to do more with some of the ARPA funds, then the question becomes, do we want to find, or how do we find that difference in the general fund or not? In other words, we could do fewer CIP. We could do fewer vehicles, we could do fewer sidewalks as an option, or we can look for other places to find the sources, take it out of general funds, and if we took it out of general funds, something has got to give there.
Right. Well, it's important to keep in mind with all aspects of the CIP is that I like to think of it as you're delaying the inevitable, right? It doesn't necessarily go away. It just is going to take you more time to figure out where you're going to come up with the money to pay for it, right? So the sidewalks, for example, the sidewalk projects, for example, the residents are still going to expect those sidewalk projects to be done, right? Whether you are telling them that it's going to get done in 24 or 25 or 26, they're still expecting it to get done. So with CIP, sometimes it's more of a delay. And one of the things Councilmember Siemens has helped me to understand, sometimes when you delay for too long, it actually costs you more money. So with the CIP, we could do exactly what you're saying. You can say, I want to cut it, and we're just going to deal with less money for sidewalks. You could do that. It might mean that in 2025, those same sidewalks come right back. And you decide then what you want to do with them.
I hear you, and I agree, and it's also a question of level of service. It doesn't mean, we can perhaps tighten our belts and get used to, in certain areas where there's a different level of service, and that we're willing to, willing to wait, and we're willing to deal with something less than what we had before. But anyhow, I appreciate your clarification.
No worries. Councilmember Siemens?
Thank you, Mayor. And possibly I misunderstood something that Councilmember Gibson said, but I just wanted to be clear that if we decrease any of the ARPA funding, that doesn't decrease our needed tax rate. Right. That's all.
Because the tax rate is based on the general fund. Right, so yeah, yeah. All right. I see no lights. Going once. Going twice. We're done. Oh, no, Terry. We're so close.
I just turned it on so I could say goodnight.
Mayor, just before you close, I think it'd be helpful if we could talk a little bit about the reconciliation process.
Yes.
You mean now?
Yeah, yeah, just quick,
sure.
just quickly.
I think that's right.
Because I just want to make sure that we're all prepared for the discussion. And I think the way that, and you all know more than I, but I think the way that it's worked in the past is that there have been some staff has been provided with some kind of pre-information to prepare some of the documentation that'll be used to guide the discussion. And a lot of that preparation is informed by council, and it comes in the form of reconciliation requests. So, and Mayor, correct me if I'm wrong here, but I think that what has been helpful in the past is that council will submit the items that they have in mind for reconciliation, either additions or deletions from the existing budget. We'll pre-populate that information in one of the spreadsheets that's used to guide the conversation real time. And it's been helpful in that it kind of speeds the process up and also prevents any, I think, errors in the management of those documents in real time. So to the extent that we can get that information from council in advance of Wednesday's meeting and enough time for staff to prepare the documentation, it would be incredibly helpful. Otherwise, you'll be giving us the reconciliation numbers. We'll be adding them while the conversation is happening. And again, that just, it adds to the process.
Do you have something to say?
I'm new at this game, and so part of it is understanding what my colleagues want. We haven't talked about those items yet, so there is a couple of reconciliation points, right? So I guess I personally, could come up with some things, but I would come up with a better list if I have some conversation with my colleagues, and we haven't had those conversations. So I guess my assumption, and I did ask the mayor about how to prepare, whether we have to have a fully fleshed out this much money plus or minus this line item, have that fully fleshed out ahead of time, or whether in the discussion, I'm thinking about an increase here, I'm thinking about a decrease there, whether there's any room for a discussion, or whether it has to be basically fully fleshed out ahead of time, which is what I hear you would prefer.
So it is, if there is an idea, and some members may have already started keeping notes of where you would like to make a reconciliation request. That's always helpful. So if there are certain things that you all already have at the forefronts of your minds or things that you would like to adjust, definitely send those items forward to staff and they can start pre-developing the reconciliation list. But to the question of, is there an opportunity to change your request? And the answer to that is yes. It can happen that you have, hey, I'm thinking about taking out $10,000 on parks, right? You can then decide, what will happen typically is members of council will kind of have some conversations. Then you may decide to amend it. You may say, instead of doing $10,000, I'm fine with doing 5, and then everybody votes, and then it moves forward. So it is possible for you to change your mind. There are other members of council who may make a different decision. They may decide we're going to add $20,000 for this particular project, and another council member may say, I want to do $10,000. So it is a running list. It gets reconciled at the end, and there's definitely room to change.
The votes are at the end.
Correct.
Okay.
And we will have multiple days of reconciliation, so it's possible.
Yeah, good. Thank you for that clarification.
Is there a point to keep in a second list just for ARPA? For changes within ARPA?
I don't think so. So the challenge with the ARPA is the only time it makes sense to keep track, in my mind, and I defer to you all, to keep track with like changes with ARPA is when they actually impact the general fund. So if there is a change in ARPA, let's say we want to reduce the ARPA dollars that are going towards the CIP by $50,000. And instead, we want to keep the same amount of sidewalks, so that goes in the general fund, and that increases our budget by, tax rate by less than half a cent, right? That is something, that's a way in which ARPA monies can impact our overall budget and our tax rate.
Right, but if we, to David's point, if we have suggested changes within ARPA and we don't voice them, we pass this, the budget for ARPA that is proposed is the one we get. And then we have to go
And do
do
an
a
amendment.
budget amendment, which is fine with me. I just want to know which way you want to do it.
Yeah.
Because we could, if there are concrete proposals to change ARPA within ARPA, do you want to keep track of them now and just make them now? And that would require a separate list.
Yeah,
I guess that's what I'm trying to say.
sure.
For
I mean,
simplicity's sake, I think it would be easier to just do the general fund amendments or general fund reconciliation items, and those ARPA items that would impact the general fund. And then to, at a later date, have the ARPA discussion. I think it's already complicated enough to try to do the general fund discussion reconciliation. Adding another piece, particularly with a lot of folks who haven't done it before, I think would be quite inefficient.
And I think somebody said that there is already a time scheduled for the next ARPA update, and it's soon.
Right.
yeah, there's
So
nothing.
that would be the time then that we would do the accounting within ARPA.
Yeah. My thought was, it's not currently scheduled on the calendar, but thought would be end of May or sometime in June.
This would be
But it was
reasonable.
after the FY24 budget process was
Because otherwise
finalized.
we've got people working on
Make sure I
programs.
add it
Yeah,
in.
because otherwise we've got people working on programs that may.
Because most of them are already, for the most part.
As long
the
as you don't
same.
give it away, give it to
Okay.
Yeah.
the CIP, then you can't do it.
All right, Councilmember Gibson?
I'm sorry.
All right.
We were all chatting.
Okay, sorry, we
You were
started.
chatting, I was
I'm sorry, my fault. All right, I'm hoping we can all go home now. So again, just want to stress to everyone, if you already have in the forefronts of your mind, items that you would like to submit for budget reconciliation, please send them to Mr. Eubanks so that they're able to at least get that preliminary list ready to roll for Wednesday.
May I ask, would it be helpful that we copy the rest of the council so that we,
I would love to see it, but I-
ahead of time, you
Yeah,
know?
that's fine, that's possible.
Okay.
Mayor,
Councilmember Hunter?
with apologies due to my jury duty, I will not be able, and I have a budget meeting with my ward tomorrow night. I will not be able to give that to you in writing yet, but
It's okay.
I'm not
I will,
either, and
I will be here.
No, it's okay. We have a couple of reconciliation sessions that are scheduled, so there is still time.
And if you could send it to myself and Director Chung, please, if you have those items.
All right. Any other questions, thoughts? All right. Awesome. Well, thank you so much. We appreciate you all. We're getting there. We're almost we're almost to the end of the budget season. Eventually. All right. Thank you all so much. And with that, do we have a second to adjourn in this meeting? All right. Thank you all so much. Have a good night. Meeting is adjourned.